Get started, I'm going to unshare my screen and Vas is going to give us our introduction. Just to remind everybody, each of these sections, there are 4 sections, is 45 minutes long. And we have a half-hour break that begins in an hour and a half. So in about an hour and a half, we'll have our break. And otherwise, we will be here. So Vas, take it away.
Thank you, Lee. Hi, everybody. A couple things before I jump in here. Just by a quick show of hands, I know Mona is quite familiar with Globus. The other folks that are in the session, if you could just raise your hand if you are currently using Globus. I just want to calibrate my introductory sort of slides. I don't know if you're able to do that.
You would do that by clicking on the participants tab. There should be an option there to raise your hand.
Okay.
Great.
All right. So so what I will do is I have a lot of material packed into this intro because I want to get all of you at least somewhat level set on what Globus is before we start diving into the more technical bits that relate to building science gateways with Globus services. So so first off, I will apologize in advance in case we have gate crashes to the party. My dog is usually well behaved, but you never know. So I want to clarify what Globus is as an organization, because sometimes we get people that are confused. They think we are a sort of a regular commercial software company. We're actually a group at the University of Chicago. We're a university department in the VP of Research's office, and we're pretty much a bunch of people that are interested in helping everybody do their research better, especially research that's sort of data intensive. And doing that by delivering sustainable software. And I've underlined sustainable software because we are trying to build this model in a way that doesn't rely on our funders. So our funders have been generous, very generous over many years in supporting new development and sort of exploration of cool new things. But as those things become sort of more productized and available to the broader community, we just end up operating the service on behalf of everyone. And so we rely on subscriptions to do that. So even though you can use the basic transfer features of the service free, we always encourage folks to support us by subscribing. And this is just a list of some of the folks that are currently paying subscribers. And I'm happy to answer questions about that at any point as well, if you like, but I'm not going to focus on the subscription model at all today. And by the way, if you want to ask a question, I think you're allowed to just unmute yourself. I don't mind being interrupted. In fact, I hope, that sort of makes it a little more real and interactive, but you can also obviously post things in the chat. All right, so first off, I'm going to focus on a couple of the core capabilities in the service. So at the base of everything is this reliable file transfer service. So I, the researcher, have some data to move from one system to another, and these systems can be pretty much anything. We'll talk throughout the afternoon about the different types of systems that Globus connects. But the idea here is that I can just go to Globus, select the file, find the system I want to transfer from, select the files, click the go button to send it off to the other system, and then I can walk away, and Globus will take over and essentially manage the whole process without me being in the loop. It'll work through transient errors if it runs into things that it can sort of work through, like temporary network glitches and things like that. And basically, it's just a fire and forget mechanism, and I'll just get a notification when things are done, or I'll get a notification if Globus needs me to intervene for some reason. For instance, if it's a very long running transfer, I'm moving, a petabyte of data or something, and my login, my credentials have expired on one of the systems, Globus will prompt me to log in, and so it can continue. But basically, the service handles the stop, start, restart, and making sure the data get from one point to another reliably. The other really critical key feature that we're going to use a lot in today's session, especially, is the ability to share data. And so this is a way by which I, again, as a researcher with collaborators, typically at many other institutions, can share my data from a system that only I have local access to. So for instance, if I have a cluster on campus here at UChicago, and I want to share data with all of you, most of you don't have UChicago accounts. So what I can do is use Globus to grant you access to some part of the data on that system by virtue of me having access to it. And so we'll talk more about what that looks like, and you'll see it in action as well. So the very high level architecture of Globus is we have this service at the bottom here. That's something that we host and operate on AWS. We don't have our own infrastructure, data center or any other sort of hard infrastructure. And what you see out there are these things we call endpoints. I'll talk about them in the next slide. But basically, data move between the endpoints, and Globus sort of sits out on the side and talks to those endpoints and makes sure that they're doing the things they're supposed to do. It's very important to understand that the data doesn't go through Globus in any way. We don't stage, relay it, whatever. So, and that's an important part of our security posture, that your data is only visible to you. The only thing we see are things like file names and file paths and so on. And so what are these endpoints? So you can think of this as something that abstracts your storage. In other words, it takes a storage system, and it can be a storage system of practically any type, and it makes it visible, accessible via Globus. And you'll hear Leon and I talk about things called collections and endpoints. We're in this transition period now where the architecture's changing, and we've introduced this new term called a collection. It used to be everything was just an endpoint. So you can sort of equate an endpoint to the system administrator's view of things, and the collection as sort of the end user's view of the data that they see. But if you hear us using those interchangeably, they sometimes are sort of one and the same thing logically. And useful endpoints. So we're gonna, when I experiment, when we go into some of the demonstrations and the hands-on exercises, we're gonna use these Globus tutorial endpoints. And there are also a bunch of other endpoints out there that you have access to just by virtue of logging into Globus. These are sort of publicly accessible to any authenticated Globus user. ESNet runs a whole set of great endpoints that are well provisioned, so you can use those to test your own connection and move data to and from your own systems with those. And so how do you create one of these endpoints? You do that by installing a piece of software called Globus Connect. And once you do that, there's different flavors of this. There's a server version that supports by default any POSIX compliant file system, but then you can sort of augment that with one or more of these connectors, as we call them, and that gives you that allows Globus to then access some of these object stores and archival systems and so on. And we continue to add to this list. We currently are in the final stages of testing a connector to iRods. So for those that use iRods to manage their storage, that will also be natively supported very soon. And then we have plans in the works to support OneDrive and other systems down the road. Okay, so let's take a look. I'm going to just turn slides off and switch over to the screen here. Let me see. Are you still seeing? I'm hoping you're seeing my browser. Lee, can you see my browser? Just checking.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So the way I got to this page was I went to globus.org. I clicked login, and it dropped me onto this login page, which is sort of a little non-traditional, right? And there's no username password, so to speak, on here. There's a list of over 1,000 institutions, though, whose identity systems we trust through a number of different federations. So, you know, in an ideal case, your institution is on here. If it's not, there are ways to add it. We can talk about that later if you like. But if you do see your institution here, you can select it, and then you actually will authenticate by going to your institution's login system, identity system. So here I'm redirected to my UChicago account. I log in. What you saw flash up there briefly was the two-factor screen. We use Duo. I have that turned. I have that configured to only prompt me every 30 days, so it doesn't. So I don't have to keep putting codes in. But it would. So any system that supports multi-factor authentication just works the same way it usually does. So that drops us into this sort of the default view, the file manager in the Globus web app. And the most sort of common use case is I need to move files from system A to B. So I click on the collection that I want to access. So I'm going to say I'll move some files from my campus cluster here, the UChicago Midway cluster. You'll see when I access that, it drops me straight into into my home folder. And that's because wherever possible, Globus will attempt to do single sign-on. So it'll try and reuse the credentials that it currently has, the valid active credentials. So in this case, I just logged in with my UChicago identity. It can turn around and use that to log me into this system, because this system also uses the same identity provider at UChicago. So let's say I wanted to move some data to there from, I'll just pick some other system here, Petrol Testbed. We're going to be using this system a lot as well. So transferring is as simple as select the things you want to transfer and click the start button. I can also label this transfer, SGCI transfer. I can set options to sync based on checksums, dates, and file sizes, and so on. So all the kinds of things you might expect if you're familiar with tools like rsync and so on. The only one that you'll see is checked by default is verify file integrity. This is what turns on the so-called sort of the reliability layer in Globus. So this will ensure that Globus reads back a file after transferring it. Will checksum it. It will compare the checksums to the source and destination copies, and only if they match will it sort of continue. If it doesn't, if it finds a problem, it'll stick that file back on the queue and try again later. And you can also encrypt the data channel. By default, that's unencrypted, but as a system administrator, you can force that. And there are also some other levels in the Globus service. There's a thing called a high assurance level, which always turns that on if you're dealing with protected data, for instance. So I'll just leave that off and click the start button, and that's it. So now this transfer is working. I can go and look at it if I want to, but typically this is just going to run, and I'll get notified when that's complete. And that's really all there is to it, right? If there are issues, Globus will typically work through it, right? So that was just 3 megs. So they're the files that I just moved. So that's the most basic sort of point and click transferring of files. I'll quickly show you what the sharing capability looks like. So as I said, if I wanted to share some data on this system with all of you, perhaps, and you obviously don't have local access to this data directly, I can select that. I can click this the share icon here. This now allows me to create what's called a guest collection, or a shared endpoint. It's another term you might hear me using. So I'm going to call this SGCI share. So what I'm actually doing here is I'm creating, you can think of it as a set of permissions that are overlaid on top of the underlying file system permissions. So at no time does Globus touch the local file system permissions. That's always under the full control of you as a system administrator. But we can create this virtual overlay that Globus maintains, or that you manage as sort of the person with the underlying permissions. And so I can add an individual user that I want to share with. I can add a group of users, or I can make it sort of more publicly available to all users of Globus. So I can do that. say add permission. So anybody who's now authenticated in Globus can go to the file manager and look for SGCI share. And it'll show up just like another endpoint, just like another collection, except that you'll see some files in there that I've shared with you. Okay. So that's just a quick walkthrough on sharing and transfer. I'm going to switch back to slides here. Any questions at this point? I'm not, sorry, I'm kind of on my train going here. I just want to make sure I give you guys time to jump in if you'd like. And again, for those that are familiar with Globus, this is probably very old hat. I apologize, but I did see we have some folks that are new to the service. Okay. So what you saw there was this web application, but Globus has a couple other interfaces that you can use to work with the service. There's a command line interface, and then there's also a REST API. And the REST API is really what underpins both of these, both the web app and the CLI. They both talk to the same REST API, but you can access this REST API directly in your Science Gateway, and that's essentially what the bulk of what we're going to talk about today. But I do want to show you, before we jump into talking to the REST API, I do want to quickly talk about the command line interface, because sometimes this is a very handy way to automate simple tasks as far as, you know, getting data setups, creating shared collections, and so on. So the command line interface is just basically a set of Python tools, Python scripts, and you run it, you install it, and then you run it, you know, at the command line in your shell. So rather than me talk about it, I'll just show you what that looks like. So I have it installed here. So when I type Globus, it by default gives me a list of the commands I can run. First thing I need to do is log in, because this command line interface is just another client to the backend Globus service, right? So it's going to talk to that API. So I need to tell it who I am. So I'm going to log in. What that does is it redirects me to a browser. So I'll pull it over here. You can see I'm actually logging in. So I'm just going to log in with my ID. I was already logged in. I have to consent to allow this client, the CLI, to access certain bits of information about me from the Globus service. So this is familiar to anyone who's used things like, you know, login with Google, login with Facebook, and other sort of federated identity mechanisms. So this, you know, I'll just accept that, and I'll talk about the consents model in just a little bit as well, because that's kind of important to a lot of what we do. So I'm logged in here, and now I can do things like maybe go here, just find some commands to run. So I can do, I have an endpoint set up. Let me just put that up here. I have an endpoint called EP. So this is the way you talk to Globus resources, to endpoints and collections and so on, and users, and everything is pretty much through a UUID, right? So a unique, globally unique identifier. So I've stored this in here, so I can do something like, oops, sorry, do Globus LS EP, $EP, right? So that'll just do an LS, a listing of the files on that endpoint, right? I can see, for instance, all the shared endpoints I have on that on that system. You'll see this is the SGCI share that I just created that shows up there. So these are different sets of virtual permissions that I've created on top of that endpoint. And I can also initiate a transfer the same way that I would through the command line, but I'm doing it the same way I would do through the web app, but I'm doing it through the command line. So here I'm transferring from this endpoint, this directory, to some other endpoint / Globus perf test U Chicago. So, and that task that I just created, I can switch over and I can actually go look at it over here in my activity, right? And you'll see that's actually the transfer that I just ran, right? So I just transferred half a gig from my Midway cluster to Pam Hill out at NCAR. So that is a quick look at the CLI. Let me see how we're doing for time. Okay. So let me go back to my slide deck. Any questions on CLI? I see Lee's answering some things in the chat, but let me know if you have something that you want to ask live. And I'll just point to this. You'll have access to these slides, I assume, through the conference website. But this is a link to one of the repos that has some examples of what you can do with a CLI. It has simple things like syncing a directory and so on.
Yes.
But yes,
yeah. We do have one question in chat for you.
Yeah.
How long do the credentials last?
It depends. It really depends on the identity provider that you use to get the credentials from. You can set it up, to be a day, multiple days, and typically what you do is, and what will maybe Lee will talk about it, but I'll steal some of the thunder here. You can set it up such that when you authenticate, you not only get back an access token, so your main credentials for using the service, but you also get what's called a refresh token. And then every time subsequent to that, when you use the access token, it refreshes the refresh token. So it's sort of an evergreen process such that you never have to re-authenticate. And that's particularly important when you're using the command line, because you want typically to have some things run unattended after the initial authentication. Does that answer the question? Okay, great. Right, so that's all well and good, but gateways talk to APIs typically. So we do have, as I said, a set of APIs which form this platform of services that you can integrate into your own gateways, also other web portals, or any other type of web application. Really, it's just as I said, it's just a standard REST API. So there's a whole bunch of services that we expose through APIs. We're only going to touch on a handful of these today. The top two are going to be pretty central to what we do. Auth underpins everything. So Globus Auth is the identity and access management service that you saw me use, well, indirectly. And you didn't see the service itself, but that's what I've been using throughout every time I'm authenticating or checking into, whether I have permissions to do something. It goes through Auth. Groups is a way to allow to control access to resources without having to do it on a user-by-user basis. I'll show you that as well. I'm sure Lee will probably use groups at some point. And then, of course, the transfer service is kind of central. Lee will cover search and how we create persistent identifiers later on. So I won't talk to those now. I don't want to steal too much of his thunder. But I do want to talk about Globus Auth and the Globus Transfer service, because those are, again, the two most basic services and central to most of what people will do with Globus in a science gateway. So the idea behind Globus Auth is it's a relatively simple way. We've tried to really simplify the way that you interact with web apps using existing identities and allow it to allow this interaction to be both between a user and a service, as well as between two services directly. So if you have your gateway calling out to another service, whether it's directly as it's the service itself or on behalf of the user, there are ways to handle that through Globus Auth. And the system is it's sort of language and framework agnostic. It's based on the Oauth 2 standard. It really is the Oauth 2 standard. and OpenID Connect, which is the standard that defines the endpoints against which one authenticates. So if you're familiar at all with the Oauth 2 and Oauth in general, you'll understand how it works. I'm going to briefly talk about a couple of the flows just so we understand what's going on. But part of what we try and do with Globus Auth is to make it really, really simple, basically reduce it to a handful of lines of code for you to actually take advantage of these very powerful features. And you can do that using any of the standard OAuth libraries. Google has one that's widely used, but we also have it built into our Python SDK. So that's what we will use today. And if you are a Python programmer, that might be a sort of an easy way to go because there's a lot of sample code and things out there for that. So just some fundamental concepts about Globus Auth. I mentioned scopes and consents. So scopes are the different parts of an API, the different functions of an API that your gateway or your web client, whatever, would like to access. So you need to define when you make a call to the auth service, you ask for a certain scope to be granted as part of that access token. A service can have multiple scopes, right? So I can allow people to only do transfers, or can allow them to do transfers and manage endpoints or what have you, just as an example. So there are really many different ways that you can sort of carve out your scopes, but this is up to you as a developer to define. If you're just using Globus services, the service you already have built, there are predefined scopes, so you don't have to know it. You just select the scopes you want and off you go. And then consents are what the user sees when, as you saw me when I logged in through the CLI, it's a confirmation that the user says it's okay for this science gateway or this web app or whatever to access some resource on my behalf. I also want to talk about the concept of a Globus account, because this is, for a lot of folks, they think of an account as some sort of real resource out there. You typically have your account and profile. It has a username, a password, emails, etc. There is no concept of an account as a first-class entity, if you will, in Globus. The Globus account is actually a collection of what we call linked identities. So there's a primary identity, which is usually the one the first identity that you use to log in and access the Globus service becomes your primary identity. And then after that, you can go ahead and link other identities, because many of us have multiple affiliations. So for instance, my primary identity is actually a Globus one, but then I've linked my University of Chicago identity. I've linked my Oregon National Lab identity because I have a joint appointment there. So it's fairly common in the research world to have these multiple affiliations. So you can have all these identities linked together such that if someone knows you by one identity and they want to share with you, for instance, on that, they can, and you can access it by logging in via any of those identities. So again, there's no such thing as an account with an identifier. You usually just get the primary identity of the user from the set of identities, potentially, if they have multiple linked, and that's the account. And for some things, especially in a science gateway context, you can set what we call the effective identity. So you can require that the user presents an identity from a particular identity provider in order to access your service. So I can say, this science gateway is only available to UChicago people, so you must log in with a uchicago.edu identity. And again, Globus Auth will enforce all that. You just sort of, put a parameter in your login script, and that's it.
Lee,
yeah.
Sorry, Vas, quick question.
Yeah.
And I restricted based on country, so just U.S. identities. Is that possible?
No, not at this point. There's no geographic sort of restrictions. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. And then I also want to make a distinction between identity ID versus username. So we, in Globus Auth, we have every identity has a unique, a UUID that we know will always be unique. And you should always use this in your code, in your Science Gateway code, to refer to an identity, just because there are some weirdnesses with some identity providers. So for instance, within Common, they allow institutions to reuse the actual username. So I'm Vass at uchicago.edu. If I leave the university, some point down the road, someone else who likes VAS as an abbreviation maybe shows up, and the university can decide to give them access, to make that their username. So you'll have Vass at uChicago, but actually that would refer down the road to a totally different Globus identity, right? And we have there's easy ways to map to and from the username and the identity, because obviously you don't want users looking at UUIDs. That's not very pretty. So this is a flow that you will see shortly. I'll just give you an idea of what the OAuth three-legged flow looks like. If you haven't done this before, if you're not familiar with Auth, so the user shows up in the Science Gateway in the browser. They access it. You get redirected to an authorization server, which in this case is Globus Auth itself. Globus Auth then says, okay, you pick the identity provider that you want. It goes off to that identity provider. You authenticate. You put in your credentials in your identity provider. Again, we don't want to be the store for any secrets, so we prefer that you log in directly with that identity provider. And then if that succeeds, Globus Auth sends back what's called an authorization code to your to the Science Gateway, to your application, and then automatically your app needs to go back and exchange that authorization code and get back one or more access tokens, depending on the service or services that it wants to access. So and then once it has those tokens, so this all happens. These three steps actually happen. You kick them off, and then once the user logs in, the second step and the code exchange happens automatically. So once you have the access tokens in your Science Gateway, then you can turn around and use those. To access in any of the Globus services like Globus Transfer and so on. Okay, so if it's sort of a bit of an eye chart, yes, it is. You'll just see this in action shortly when I jump into the Jupyter Hub, and we can talk about it more then.
Key note about that,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Vass, is that everything that's on that slide is standard
Yes.
OpenID Connect and Oauth. And so there's nothing Globus specific about it. If you've used OpenID Connect or Oauth in any other application, you've already got the code that does this.
Yeah, thanks. Great point. Yep. Okay, so the other service we will be talking to extensively here is obviously the main transfer API. All of these services, as I said, they use a REST approach, and they use JSON formatted documents for the body of your requests and for the responses. And all the calls to these services are authorized using a bearer token. So basically, the access token you get back gets encoded and sent off as a bearer token to the service as part of your call. But all that gets done for you. For instance, if you're using the Globus SDK, that all gets done for you, so you don't have to mess with creating headers and so on. And so I've mentioned the SDK a couple of times. This is where you can access it. We'll walk through this in just a few minutes here. But basically, what you do is everything that you use. The thing that you use to access every part of the transfer service is through a transfer client. There are equivalent clients for accessing Globus Auth, for Globus Search and other services that Lee will show later on. So this is the standard mode: is you import the type of client you want, you create an instance of that, and then you can run various commands using that client. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the 7 or 8 minutes that we have here is go through some basic API calls, and we'll sort of experiment with the API, and we're going to use a Jupyter notebook that's hosted at this Jupyter Hub address, jupyter.demo.globus.org. So I'm going to, I'm not going to use this Jupyter Hub notebook. I'm going to use a different one, so I apologize for that. In fact, I realized that some of these instructions are a little out of date because I updated a lot of the notebooks yesterday. So let me just switch out of that and go directly to my notebooks. So it's jupyter.demo.globus.org.
All of these links are in the resources tab in Kiko chat if you need them.
Yeah. And let me know if what size is visible, Lee.
Maybe a little bigger, please.
How's that?
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
That looks good.
All right. So we're going to look in here. So again, this one, I didn't show you me doing this, but I will show you quickly. So if you, the first time you showed up, you're probably prompted to sign in with Globus, and then it might take a few seconds to spin up a notebook in a server instance for you. Once you have that, you can go into the notebooks. I'm going to go and access this native app Oauth notebook. This one and the Jupyter Hub are identical except for the upfront piece that deals with authentication and getting access tokens from Globus Auth. I like to show this one because it sort of shows you what goes on behind the scenes. So if you're not familiar with notebooks, you can just step through them by hitting run or shift enter on a given cell. So there's all these different cells of some, descriptive text and then code. So I'm gonna set some variables. So you see here, I'm using, again, the UUIDs of the various endpoints that I'm gonna work with. And then here's where the authentication happens. So we're gonna do a flow, that's called a native auth client flow. So this is going to, when I run the cell, it's going to kick off that three-legged flow, and then it's going to show me this this one-time use URL, right? So I will click on that. I'm already logged into Globus in this browser, so I don't have to sort of re-authenticate. But again, this is another consents page that says, I'm agreeing to allow this application, this notebook, to access Globus services on my behalf. So I'm going to say that's fine. And so it gives me this code, which I can then take back and scroll down. See, I have a different code here from the previous run. So I'll paste that in here and then again, run that cell. And if you see nothing, that's a good sign, because that means that you've successfully authenticated and you actually now have a token to access at least the transfer service. So you get back a whole bunch of tokens potentially. In this case, all we care about is getting a token to access this transfer API, right? And if I wanted to print that, I could actually do that. Let me actually just add a quick print here and print transfer access token. Right, so if I print this, you'll see that that's what the token looks like, right? And right below that, I use that token to actually call the Globus Transfer service. So I created what's called a transfer client, right? By just doing that. So from the Globus SDK transfer client using the token that I just got. So now I can turn around and do things like get help on a method. So that's the nice thing about the SDK. I can call the help method on any of these commands. So this is the get endpoint command. But if I want to do something useful, like get information on an endpoint, so this Globus tutorial endpoint that I mentioned, I can just run the get endpoint command and call that function, and it'll come back and show me a bunch of information on that endpoint, right? That's the full detail. So this is kind of the standard request response mode. As I said, all of these responses are JSON documents. So, you can use various tools to parse those however you feel comfortable. I can do the same sort of thing that I do in the web app, is search for an endpoint or a collection, right? So this search actually searched for all my endpoints. So this is the list I see for my endpoints. And just for comparison, if I go back to my file manager, to the web app, and I search here and I click my endpoints or my collections, you'll see this is the same list: 1,000 genomes, all these DME ones, et cetera, et cetera. So, oops, sorry. So that's, again, we're talking to the same backend service. In this case, we're talking to it directly programmatically. The web app talks to the same one via different means. So that's just really by way of giving you an introduction to the services and the APIs. Lee's going to dive into more detailed examples, specific examples of using this in a Science Gate or a data portal context. I will say that this notebook has a lot of sample code for doing many different things on the with the API. I recommend that you spend some time with it to understand some of these functions and explore the commands here before you try them in your code. Of course, you can do the trial and error approach as well if you like I usually do, but it's here, and there are a few other notebooks, as you noticed, that we'll go through during the rest of the tutorial. But I do want to pause there. We're right on time. Hopefully I haven't rushed too much, but give you folks time for any questions on that before Lee gets to the next level.
So Lance asked a question in chat about getting the Oauth tokens, and I'm suggesting that maybe we take that up during the break with Lance privately. If that's okay with you, Lance, we'll do that. I'll be available during the break for sure.
I will show you quickly one thing which I don't think Lee was going to show. Were you going to talk about Jupyter Hub integration at all, Lee? Probably not.
No.
Okay, so this other notebook that's named the same, except it's Jupyter Hub Auth instead of native app auth. If you open that and run it, what this is actually doing, it's a good illustration of how Globus Auth is integrated into something else. In this case, it's integrated into the Jupyter Hub platform itself. So when you open this notebook, what happens is the authentication doesn't happen by you going and authenticating against Globus Auth directly. It actually gets, if you're already authenticated, which I have in this case, it actually looks at this environment variable in the Globus and in the Jupyter Hub environment, and it pulls the tokens because they're in there, they're encoded, right? So when authenticated, the Jupyter Hub stored those Globus tokens in my sort of local Jupyter server. So now I can just access those. So if I actually print those, you'll see what they look like. So if I run this, there are my tokens, right? Actually, all my identities set is there as well as a bunch of tokens. So there's a token for accessing the auth service, the group service, and there's my transfer token and so on. So that's one way to sort of introspect, if you will, your tokens. That's already there for you. Sorry, I answered the question, hopefully partially.
Yeah, I think Lance actually has a specific question about the way that they're getting tokens for other applications, but we can talk about that during the break. That's
all right,
fine.
Great.
Okay, would you mind turning over the screen sharing, Vas?
Yes. No, I want to keep sharing.
Share, please. Okay, I'm going to share my desktop over here and go ahead and for the moment.
By the way, sorry, as Lee gets started here, if you think of other questions or other things come to mind, I'll be monitoring the chat like he was while he's talking. So I'll be happy to cover those there.
All right, so we're shifting gears a little bit at this point in the tutorial. Vass's introduction was intended to give everybody a common understanding of the basic concepts of the Globus service so that we can talk about specific use cases in these last 3 sections. Each section is going to talk about a particular thing that you may want to do in your gateway. And the approach we're going to take is to, first of all, describe what is this thing that you'll want to do in your gateway. And then we're going to show you an actual portal or gateway that does that, kind of show you what the user experience looks like. What are we actually, what are we trying to enable? And then after we've done that, we'll actually dive into some of the code, either looking at the GitHub repository for the portal that we showed, or looking at a slightly simplified version in a Jupyter notebook that basically walks through the same things that that portal does. And so I just wanted to give you a heads up that these next 3 45-minute segments are going to be in a slightly different format. And hopefully that'll work for you in terms of, kind of giving you an idea of what is it we're trying to enable very concretely, and then what are the pieces that you need to have to do it, and what does the code look like in the end. And one of the messages that I hope you'll take away from that is that actually it ends up being very little code. The tricky part is usually just figuring out what are the pieces we need to have in place for it to work. So the first scenario that I'm going to talk about is kind of the bread and butter of the Globus service, which is large-scale data transfer. And Vass, I think, did a really good job of explaining what Globus is in general. And one of the key points that he covered was that there are many different interfaces that you can use to work with this common data transfer and sharing service. There definitely is the mobile-friendly web app. You can use it on desktop computers or laptops. You can use it on tablets. You can even use it on your phone. The web app does a really good job of adjusting to different screen sizes and browsers and things like that. And that's wonderful. I mean, I use Globus on my cell phone sometimes when I'm traveling and I need to do something quickly. But it also has platform support, as Vass pointed out. There's the command line interface, which he showed, and there's the REST APIs, RESTful APIs that you can use, and there's a Python software development kit that you can import into your Python environment. You can, of course, do things from Jupyter notebooks. And so if you have a data science application that you're working on in Jupyter, we have really good integration with that. And you can even log into your notebook using Globus and then use the tokens that that generates to do things very easily using the Python interpreter in a notebook. So basically, anything that you can do in the web app, in the web interface, or that you're familiar with seeing there, sharing and guest collections and permissions and all of that stuff, you can also do using either the command line interface or the software development kit, or the REST APIs directly if you're using some language other than Python. So here's a question. Why would your gateway need to transfer big files? What are some of the common scenarios that we see science gateways doing that involve Globus? One of them is running an analysis on a community data set. So this is a scenario where your gateway allows the user to pick a data set that's already in the gateway's library maybe, and run some kind of standard analysis over it. So pick an analysis and do it on a chunk of a data set, maybe one that nobody has thought to do before, and find out what the results of that analysis are. In order for that to happen, the data, wherever it's stored, needs to be moved into the compute server that the gateway is using to run the analysis job. And so Globus can be used to do that. Another example would be to analyze data that the gateway user has. So it's on the gateway user's local computer. Maybe it's on their laptop, or maybe it's on their lab system. And the idea is that the data needs to be, sorry, my Zoom controls are in the wrong place from watching Vass earlier. Sorry for the interruption. Okay. The data needs to be moved from the gateway user's computer to wherever that compute server is, again, that the gateway is going to run the analysis job on. Oops. Another example would be allowing the gateway user to download large data that was generated in the gateway. So the gateway maybe is a simulation gateway, and it allows the user to enter parameters and maybe even pick a model, and then submit a simulation that gets run on some high performance computing system. And the resulting data then needs to be delivered to the end user, to their server, wherever it may be, or maybe even to their own personal computer. You can do that also using Globus. And then finally, a fourth example would be allowing a gateway user to add data to a community data repository. So maybe in this case, your gateway is there to allow people to build up a community repository or a data collection, and you want people to be able to submit their own data sets to that data collection. And so the data needs to be transferred to the gateway's storage, wherever that may be. Presumably you have, the gateway has access to a large data store somewhere. And you need to be able to get the data from the researcher's computer or server to that community data store. So any of those are things that would be done using Globus's transfer interface. So these are all examples of using Globus to transfer big files in your gateway. So the generic workflow for doing this in a web application or a science gateway would be, first of all, to assemble whatever credentials are going to be needed to do the transfer. Then identify the right endpoints. And as Vas showed you, in Globus, when you're using the SDK, or even if you're using the CLI, endpoints are defined or named via a UUID, which is kind of a machine readable string. And so you need to get those for the endpoints that are involved in this user's activity. And then you just need to make the request. The request might be to transfer files or folders. It might be to list the contents of a folder if you need to see what's there before you transfer something to it, or before you transfer something from it, maybe. To create a new folder, or to delete files or folders. So any of those are things that you might do. And optionally, at the end, you might want to confirm that whatever you ask to be done does get done before you move on to the next thing in your gateway. Or maybe while you're doing the next thing in your gateway, you want to notify the user when something is done. But in general, the things you need to do are first get the right credentials, then get the right endpoints, and then make your request. I think it's important also to point out some things your application shouldn't have to do when you're using Globus. First of all, you're not going to interact directly with the storage systems or data transfer nodes. So there are storage systems and data transfer nodes out there. They're already connected to Globus, and Globus, the Globus service, is what's going to do the interacting with it. So you can kind of think of the Globus service as a remote control. You don't actually touch the storage system or the data transfer nodes or interact directly with them. You interact with Globus, and Globus does the talking to the storage systems and data transfer nodes, and basically sets up a transfer that goes directly from one to the other. In no case does your gateway actually have to talk to the storage system. Your gateway also doesn't have to know how to speak the data transfer protocol. So whatever transfer protocol Globus is using, you don't need to worry about that in your gateway. Globus does all the talking to the data transfer nodes and sets up the connection between the two endpoints and monitors it and keeps track of what's been transferred and what hasn't been transferred, and does all the checksumming to make sure that all the data was transmitted correctly and no glitches happened, no bits got flipped accidentally. So Globus does all that for you. You don't have to know anything about the transfer protocol itself. You don't have to keep track of what has and has been transferred. Once you make a transfer request, you can pretty much sit back, and your gateway can sit back and assume that the transfer is going to either succeed or fail. And it's not going to fail unless something really bad happens. something that can't automatically be recovered from, because the transfer service is designed to retry things, to retransmit things if the checksum doesn't come back correctly and you know that it wasn't copied properly, anything like that. Even if one of the endpoints goes down for an hour, or they get cut off from the network for some reason, it doesn't matter from the gateway's perspective. You don't have to be the one who's responsible for restarting that. Globus will do that for your gateway. Same thing. And then you also don't have to know anything really about how many files or the sizes of files that are being transferred. You might need to know that for other reasons. Maybe it's part of the science that's being done. But if you're only concerned about getting the data from here to there, you can rely on Globus to do that. You basically say, I want this directory from here transferred to that directory there. And you can be sure that without having to know about every single file in there, Globus will get them all there. And then finally, you don't absolutely need to know when the transfer finishes unless it's important for the gateway's user experience itself. So in other words, if there's something in the gateway, like maybe you're doing a simulation, and then between that and the next stage of the computation, you need to do a data transfer, and the second stage can't start until the data transfer is finished, well, then you do need to know. But if it's really just a matter of getting the user the data after everything's done, it's not important for the next step of the gateway user experience to know, you can basically submit the transfer request, and Globus will wrap things up when everything's done, and actually email the user, ideally, most likely, to let them know when the transfer is finished. And so that's not something that you necessarily have to monitor for unless it's critical to the workflow that you're trying to enable in the gateway. Are there any questions about kind of the general, what you do and don't have to do when you're transferring data in a gateway using Globus? Let me just really quickly scan the chat to see. Nope. Okay, sounds good. I'm going to continue on then. Feel free to interrupt me if I'm saying something and losing you. All right, the next thing I want to do is switch out of my slides and show you a web application that does what I've been describing. So let me go ahead and, oh, I really. Okay, well, I'm just going to flip. All right, and move my browser window over here. Oh, come on. Wow, PowerPoint has completely commandeered my, you know what? I'm just going to get out. Yes, I do want to save them, but I want to get out. Okay, there we go. I'll worry about that later. All right, so the web portal that I wanted to show you, and Vas, can you confirm that you can see that, since I'm sharing my screen and I can't?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. This web portal, again, the link to this, mrdp.globus.org, is available in the resources tab on the tutorial page in KikoChat if you need it. The Modern Research Data Portal is a portal that our team developed that kind of walks through the basic things that people do in data-intensive research using Globus. The first thing that you do when you come to the Modern Research Data Portal is you log in, and notice that when I click the login button there, it takes me to Globus's login page, and that's because we're going to be using Globus in the portal, and we need to get permissions. So I'm going to go ahead and log in using my University of Chicago ID. And what's happening behind the scenes right now is that the Modern Research Data Portal is going through all that gobbledygook that Vas showed on his slide. And you'll notice that from the user perspective, it's actually very simple. You log in, you pick an identity provider. You might have to log in with that identity provider, or maybe not if you already did it that day. And then it just goes back. you might see a consent screen if it's the first time you're logging into the portal. And there it basically tells you what it's going to do with your credentials. And in this case, it would say things like you're going to transfer data and maybe access or download data using the browser. So, okay. So what does this what does the Modern Research Data Portal want to allow me to do? It basically has a bunch of data sets. There's a transfer button down here, so I can transfer data sets if that's what I want to do. I can click on a data set and see what's inside of it. So this is basically, think of this as a data portal that is for data distribution. We're letting people get at a community's data repository. If all I want to do is take a look at a file, Globus makes that really easy too. This file is actually on a Globus endpoint. It's on a Globus guest collection that's been created. And I can just click it and notice here this glob.us URL that it's downloading from. It's actually coming from a Globus endpoint itself and downloading directly in the browser. That's a HTTPS feature that we added in the latest version of Globus Connect server. Opened it up on my other screen, so I'm going to have to drag it over here. There. So it would just open up the file. It's a comma separated file for weather station data, I think. That's basically how you would look at an individual file. But if you wanted to do something more complicated, like transfer the whole data set with all of those files together, I could check one and then click this transfer button. When I do that, the portal automatically uses Globus's, there's a helper page in Globus called the Browse Endpoint helper page. I'll talk about in just a few minutes, that allows the user to pick the endpoint. And what it's doing here is it wants me to pick the endpoint that I want to transfer that data to. So I've already picked what data I want to transfer. Now it wants to know, where do you want to transfer it? So where I'm going to transfer it is, I've got some storage at the University of Chicago, and it's got something in it. I don't really care about that so much. I'm not even going to bother with the label. I'm just going to hit submit, and it's going to submit the transfer request for me. And it's going to return me back to the Modern Research Data Portal and show me the status of that transfer. Right now it's active. If I were to go into Globus itself, the Globus web app, I may have missed it already. I missed it. So here on activity, this is the transfer that I just did. It transferred 66 files. It wasn't very fast because it wasn't very much data. It usually takes a while for the the speed to rev up and then ramp down at the end. And if you don't have very much data, it doesn't get going very fast, but it's all done already. And so if I were to refresh this now in the Modern Research Data Portal, it'll tell me that it succeeded. Okay. 66 files were transferred. Here's where it was from and to and all that. So basically that's a website that uses Globus. And you saw a little bit of Globus when I picked the endpoint that I want to transfer to, but otherwise it was all pretty much handled in the portal. So that's the app. That's kind of what we're aiming for. Now I want to show you how we do that. Oh, that's right, I quit. I knew I would pay for that later. Now I'm going to restart PowerPoint and reload my slides. And I won't do that again. Okay. All right, so remember, the generic application workflow again was to assemble the necessary credentials, get the right endpoints, make the request, and then in this case, we don't confirm the task completion, we just display the status of the task for the user. That's what that particular app did. So how do we do that? First thing I want to do is kind of show you a very high level overview of what's happening when we do this. So in this case, I, the researcher, went to a portal. I didn't go to the space weather portal. I went to, whoops, sorry. I went to the Modern Research Data Portal, but they work pretty much the same way. And that portal used the Auth API when I logged in, and it used the transfer API when it needed to transfer data on my behalf. Okay, it talked only to Globus, the Globus Transfer service, the Globus Auth API, and Globus is what did the reaching out to the data store where the data set that I wanted to transfer is, which it knows about because that's the kind of data in place that is managed by this portal, and also the Globus Connect server where I wanted to move the data to. So it handles the control channels that talk to those two systems, and those two systems work with each other and they don't even talk to Globus when they're doing the transfer. They just depend on Globus to set that up the connection. And then the data goes back and forth directly between the two servers. So basically what we're concerned about is up here in the Auth API and in the Transfer API. Okay. So what needs to be in place for that to work? First of all, to enable uploads or downloads with the researcher's personal system, the researcher would have to install Globus Connect Personal on their system. And I can't recall, I don't think we actually demonstrated that. Did we, Vas, in the first section?
No, I
That's
didn't
okay.
show that. No.
It is in the resources links. So if you need to see how that works, let me see here. I actually put it right here. Globus Connect Personal, Mac, Windows, Linux. So if you need any, if you need to brush up a little bit on how to do that, the link is there in the resources. And the transfers in that case will use the researcher's credentials. So the researcher will need to log into the portal, but then it'll use those credentials to access their Globus Connect personal system. To enable transfers to or from the community storage, that's the side where the data is coming from, there needs to be a Globus Connect server there, and ideally you'd create a guest collection. So the storage administrator, whoever owns the storage that all the portal's storage is going to be on, will install Globus Connect server there and give you, that is the gateway operator, access. And then you, as the gateway operator who are authorized to use that endpoint, you can create a guest collection for your gateway to use. That makes it a lot simpler for your gateway to use the endpoint. It really reduces the authentication that has to happen within the gateway. Okay, how do we identify these endpoints? So for an endpoint that you know about ahead of time, in this case, this would be the endpoint where the data for the Modern Research Data Portal is, all those data sets I showed you. The easiest way to do it is just to visit that endpoint in the Globus web app and look at the details for that collection. Look at the overview tab, and there's a field there called endpoint UUID. And it even has a handy dandy clipboard icon that you can click on to copy and paste the endpoint. And then you would store that in the configuration for your endpoint, because you're going to be using that a lot. You're going to be using it over and over and over in your endpoint code. And I'll show you that when we actually look at the code. For researcher endpoints, your gateway can use the Browse Endpoint Helper page, as we did just a few minutes ago. This, here's the documentation for the Browse Endpoint page. Basically, what you do is your application calls an endpoint, calls a URI or a URL that we host, and it brings up that interface that allows the user to pick an endpoint. The user's credentials have already been gotten because you got that when they logged into your portal. And so they can use all of Globus's handy dandy user interface for finding the right endpoint to transfer something to. And then when they're done and they click that submit button, whatever they picked gets sent back to your application. So your application then gets the endpoint UUID, and then it either gets a folder path or it gets a list of file paths. And that would be if they're uploading data. You would want them to, they might need to select multiple things. And so you can also return a list of things that they've selected. So here, what I would encourage you to do is go to this documentation URL and learn about the helper page that lets your application do that. And that will give you everything you need to do to get the endpoints. Regarding credentials, again, this is just a tiny bit complicated because there's a difference between whether the transfer is something that's being done on the researcher's behalf using the researcher's permissions, or if it's being done by the gateway on its own behalf. So if we go way back to where I was, let's see, what would your gateway need to do? Right, this one right here, running an analysis on a community data set. If you're not transferring data from the researcher's system, but instead everything's being done within the gateway, you may be able to do the transfers just using the gateway's credentials. And that's what is referred to back here. Sorry for flipping around a lot. Okay. So again, if you need to touch the researcher's storage or storage that the researcher has set up, and you're using the browse endpoint helper page and things like that, you're going to need the user to log into your application using Globus in order to get the researcher's credentials. And you'll ask for permission to transfer files on the user's behalf. And when they log into your application, they'll have to grant that permission on the consent page that Globus displays when they log in. And then you'll get an access token for each researcher. And you'll need to keep track of each researcher's access token in your session cache for each logged in user. If you're in the other mode where you're doing the transfers as the gateway itself, you get gateway credentials and basically you register your gateway with Globus and you will get a client ID and secret. And you will be able to use that to get access tokens that allow transfers to happen based on the gateway's permissions. I think I have another slide about, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I should, okay. So I should have gone to the next slide. More on the researcher's credentials. I just went through this. The researcher will log in, they'll click the button, it'll take them to Globus. When your application sends them to Globus, you're going to say, when the user authenticates, please give me permission to transfer files on their behalf. There's a particular scope that you have to request. It's right here on the screen. And your application will get an access token that allows it to do transfers on behalf of the user. If you're doing it the other way, you'll use the client ID and client secret that you get when you register your application at developers.globus.org. That link is also in the resources page. You go to developers.globus.org and you'll register your application. And what you'll get back from that registration is what's called a client ID and a client secret. This is basically standard Oauth stuff. What that allows you to do is, instead of having the user log in, your application can log in behind the scenes and get an access token that allows it to do transfers. It's important for you to understand when your gateway does a transfer using its own credentials, it looks to Globus like it's being done by this client ID at clients.auth.globus.org username. So that's basically a user. And so whatever permissions your gateway needs to have need to be given to this user. So if you're setting up a guest collection that the gateway can use, create an access control list that gives your client ID at clients.auth.globus.org permission to that endpoint. And then it'll be able to transfer things to and from that endpoint. Okay, so basically what this is saying is that your application can be a quote unquote user of its own. And this is its username. It's whatever you get back from registration, your client ID at clients.auth.globus.org. And so that's how you would set up your permissions. Let's see. Yes. Okay. I know that was a little complicated. Are there any questions about that before I move along? And then I'm going to get into the code. Okay, hearing none. Let's take a look at the code. Whoops. So let's see here. Got to remind myself where I'm going. Okay, I am going to go to, right. Where's the GitHub repository? I'm looking at VAS's, okay. Docs and, okay, I'm opening it up. 1 second, it's coming up on my other screen. I'm gonna slide it over. There we go. Okay, so in the resources for part 2, there is the Docs and GitHub for Modern Research Data Portal code. Here is the GitHub repository for the code. And this is the directory that contains the portal code. And down here at the bottom, this is the code for all of the views in that Modern Research Data Portal that I showed you. You can go ahead and look at this after the tutorial if you want. This portal is developed using the Flask framework. And so you're going to see all these decorators in the Python code. And that's basically, each of these sections is the code for a page on the portal. So for example, when the user hits the login button, it redirects them to this section called auth callback. And I can show you that down here. Okay, so to log the user in, it's actually pretty simple. You set up the state for that. Let's see, yeah, okay. You use the Globus software. Actually, I should have pointed out at the beginning of the file, there is a import of the Globus SDK. So you, from the Globus SDK, you import all these different things, and that then allows you to use these SDK calls. Right. You would, first of all, this load portal client is a utility routine that just basically goes back and gets the client ID and client secret that you get from registering the portal and sets it up so that it can make calls to the Auth API. And then you use the Oauth to start flow and you request, let's see, redirect. You tell it that you want a particular set of scopes, which are configured in the configuration file. One of these scopes is the one that's requesting permission to transfer files on the user's behalf. I'm not going to flip the screen around a lot and show you that, but you can see on your own when you look at it that these user scopes in the configuration include the transfer scope. And basically that will then redirect the user's browser to Globus. And eventually it'll come back again through here and it will include a code. As Vas said, when the user is done with their login, Auth comes back with a code. And so here in this if, we're looking for that code and we're seeing, aha, okay, they're coming back from there, and they have what? We are getting...
It's in the else loop.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is right. Okay. Yeah, I was a little bit confused because it's a negative. So this is if the code is not there, then we're just starting out and we have to actually do the redirect to Globus. If the code is there, then we go down here and we use the tokens endpoint to get the tokens that Auth generated for us. And we stash them into the user session. Okay, so basically all I wanted to show here is that the result of the user logging in is that we're updating the application session for that particular user to include the tokens that came back from Globus, because those are then going to get used when we actually do things like show the browse endpoint helper or something else. Okay, so where do we actually, if I go down to here, transfer. When I, in the Modern Research portal, click the transfer button, and I get that list of data sets that are available, this is the page that does that. It is going to set up, I'm sorry, that's not true. When I click the transfer button on that page, so in other words, I've selected a set of data sets that I want to transfer. At the bottom of that page, there's a transfer button. When I click that transfer button, this routine right here gets called. So it's going to come in with a list of data sets, and it's going to need to display that browse endpoint helper page. And this is how it does it. It's actually really simple. It's only a few lines of code. So if you haven't selected any data sets, it tells you, no, you have to select some data sets and returns. If you have, then it sets up this helper page. So this is a app.globus.org page. There's the URL for it. And let's see, that's basically it. It redirects the user to that endpoint. I think it sets up some, oh, here, the action. Yeah. It says this action right here is where are you going to come back to when the user hits submit. So notice that it says submit transfer. That's the routine that it's going to call down here. And it also, file limit is 0 and folder limit is 1. So the helper page has these parameters you can set. If you set file limit to 0, it doesn't allow the user to select individual files. It only allows them to select a folder. If folder limit is 0, you can't even select folders, but it's set to 1, which means you can have a unique folder. So basically what this is doing is this is calling the browser helper page and telling it, let the user select one folder, okay? So that's what we'll expect when it comes back, is that it'll have selected one folder. And the idea is that we basically just want a destination. We want to know where the user wants this file put. So we redirect the browser there, and it leaves this application and goes to the Globus web app. And then it comes back, again, that action said, go to the submit transfer when you're done. And that's what we do. We go to submit transfer. And what we're going to find here is that the helper page has returned a set of, where is the code here? It's returned a, the endpoint ID, where did I go? Oh, yeah, okay. So the browse endpoint form is where all that data got stashed. So the request, okay. So Flask basically returns the data from the helper app in this request.form thing, which we put then into browse endpoint, and that gets used down here. The endpoint ID is where we have the endpoint for where the user wants things put. So now we know what we basically have the user's credentials, and we have the endpoints for things to go to. The folder name that they selected is right here. So basically the helper app did its job, and it helped us pick the destination endpoint. And all we have to do now is call the transfer data routine with all those parameters in it. And it should be done. So what does it do here? Oh, okay. This is starting the process of, okay, right. So this is starting the process of setting up that transfer request. We are building up this thing called transfer data. And the rest of this code is basically filling out that transfer data with the endpoints and folder names and file names that need to get transferred. And here,
Sorry, one thing just to point out that,
yeah,
sorry, is this transfer data object is there because you can actually add to it multiple source destination pairs. So you can move chunks of data from different places to different places, all as part of one transfer request. So you can build that up, and then when you submit it in line 329 there, that's when it gets fired off.
Right. So this for loop right here is basically filling out all the because the user might have selected multiple data sets. They might have checked off more than one data set. And so it's going through the list of data sets, and it's adding any of the ones that were checked to the request. And that all gets stored in this transfer data object. And then down here under line 329 is where we actually do the transfer. We pass in the transfer data, which basically has everything about the request that's needed. And it gets back a task ID. And then it can use that to display the transfer status page, which is exactly what we saw in the app. Remember, after we hit the transfer button, we get back, or after we, I guess we pick the destination folder and hit submit, the next thing we see is the transfer status where it says the transfer is active. Okay, so basically what I'm trying to show you in this example is that browse endpoint helper app is really useful because it solves one of the key problems that you have in using Globus to transfer, which is to get those UUIDs for the endpoints. You know the UUID where you're getting the data from in this case, because it's always from the same endpoint, but you don't know what endpoint the user wants the data to go to. And so you need to have some help getting that. And that's what the browser helper app is for. And again, it's really just a matter of telling the helper app, what do you want the user to be able to pick? How many files should they be able to pick? How many folders should they be able to pick? And what part of your application needs to be returned to when they've hit that submit button. By that time, then you have all the UUID information and the paths that you need, and you can build up your, where did it go? You can build up your, you can build up your transfer request, and then in one line here, submit it all. Another thing that I should point out about this is that this is really easy, mostly because we're using guest collections. We set up a guest collection on the Modern Research Data Portal's endpoint, and we're assuming that the user is giving us something probably from a personal endpoint, or maybe it's an endpoint that they've already activated. That can be part of what the helper app does for them, is help them activate that endpoint. And so we're able to auto activate here and not have to have the user provide additional credentials and things like that. So it all gets ironed out when we're using guest collections. Any questions? Here we go. So that was our code for that section. Again, I want to remind you that all the links that I gave you and all of the code that I walked through are linked from the resources page. In particular, this part 2, it doesn't look like it has a whole lot, but there's a lot in here. This is the link to the Modern Research Data Portal itself. This is a link to the GitHub that I was showing you the code from. This is the developers portal where you register your apps. And I told you, this is where you get your client ID and secret from. And this is the information about the browse endpoint helper page that played such a key role in this particular application. Okay. Des, you've been watching the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vass just tried to answer my question. I have a feeling, so I actually submitted a ticket for this and it wasn't looking too good. So I actually want to use Globus Connect or Globus for a bit of a stranger application where I want to be able to send large-ish files from sensor platforms that are deployed in the field, which means I'm using like Raspberry Pis and generally ARM-based units and or microcontrollers, which can of course run MicroPython. Catch is the endpoint. So I can't install Globus Connect, which is a major issue. So I'm really looking for a workaround that would allow me to do that, to have that device as an endpoint, but not have Globus Connect installed, especially for the microcontrollers, and basically just freeform send a file.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I think
in my response, there might be a way to do this by having the data transfer node not be on that device itself, But then if that device can somehow expose a storage mount point somehow that gets mounted on the actual data transfer node, so you could have, I'm sort of envisaging a directory structure where you've got, devices / device 1, 2, 3, 4 through N. And then you can use shared endpoints for each of those to grant access to things. But this will be a very interesting use case to look at more closely. I'll go find the ticket that you mentioned and see if we can dig into this. But it certainly is unusual. I don't know, Lee, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I do wonder, Vas, what do you think about the possibility of using HTTPS upload as a way to do this?
So then you start running into the issues with the limitations of TCP/IP, depending upon the size of the file, which are some of the things I'm trying to get around.
Okay.
I mean,
if basically you've already tried to do this with HTTP and you're having trouble with that, then the only way that Globus would be able to help would be to create an endpoint somehow on that thing so that we could use GridFTP instead of using HTTP.
Yeah, I mean,
it does sound tricky.
Even with even with GridFTP, with the parallel transfer, those devices don't typically have great I/O capabilities. But yeah, this is an interesting one. This one, I'd love to think about it some more. Yeah,
no problem. I was hoping at least that you all would at least put out a client for either Atom-based processors or the Raspberry Pi. That's my ultimate goal, but I have to have enough people behind me screaming.
Simple matter of time and resources, right? That's probably not on our roadmap at this point, but again, I think this is the first time I've heard of something like this. Lee, I don't know, you may have heard others, but certainly worth considering.
Yeah, I know that microcontrollers and small devices like that, IoT devices, do get used in a lot of sensor nets in research projects, and so I'm not at all surprised at the use case. This is probably the first time I've actually had somebody, be very direct and say, what I really want is a Globus endpoint on my Raspberry Pi device. But I'm not surprised, and I bet that you're not alone in that there are other projects out there that are using these ARM devices, Atom devices that it would be nice to be able to bring up Globus Connect personal endpoints on.
Jamie, I'm curious, how big is the data you're trying to transfer?
So right now I'm doing morning chorus and afternoon chorus for bio audiology, but I'm also looking to add video to it. So with the morning chorus, I'm looking at files around 600 megabytes per recording, so about 1.2 gig per day. But as soon as I add in the video with that, then life gets even more interesting.
Yeah, those are respectable sizes. I can see why it would be problematic to be using HTTP streams to do that. Especially
over cell in the middle of the boonies of if you get 1 bar of cellular access, you're excited.
Yeah. I think it would be fair to say that what you're really interested in Globus for isn't so much performance as much as it is the reliability layer. Is that right?
That is exactly it. And being able to easily get it into the data center here at TAC.
Yep. Okay. Well, we should follow up with you on that after the tutorial then, I think. I'm sorry that we don't have a quick answer for you here. We are technically on break from 1/2 until the hour. So I want to make sure that people are aware that you are free at this point if you want to visit the networking lounge, that is something you can do in Kiko chat. I'm going to hang out in the networking lounge for a little bit. And if you also are interested in visiting any of the other venues in the conference, you're welcome to do that. We're going to start back up again at 1 o'clock. So if any of you want to hang out with me in the networking lounge, I'll be there. Maybe Vas will join us. I'm not sure. Depends.
Actually, Lee, on the chat, I'd said Lance wanted to have a conversation with you, and
Yes, right.
and Mona wanted to join. So we can do that here, or we can go elsewhere. But it might be easier just to be here because I don't know what the networking lounge looks like.
It's a different app. It's the Wonder app. You don't
Bunch
want
of
to
people drinking virtually.
You don't want to
I
be in
know.
the Wonder. Well, they have nice chairs there, Vass. So they have nice chairs. You can be in lazy boy recliners or at the bar or.
Yeah, right. I think I'll lower my standing desk now. That'll be.
Okay, well,
extent of
it sounds as though you guys want to stay here. So I guess maybe I'll just do that. That would be fine. So anybody else who wants to take a break, feel free to mute yourself. Otherwise, we're going to talk for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll get started at 1. Well, that's 1 my time. Sorry. I don't know what time it is, your time. At the hour. All right. How did we want to go?
It might be easy if I show you what the portal does, and then we can talk about where bits and pieces might fit. So if you don't mind, I'll just share my screen. So I can do this without breaking my computer.
Let us know if there's any permission issue. It should allow you to do it, I think.
Yeah, participants can share. Yeah, there we go.
So we run a variety of portals that use a SSH certificate generator when I'm logged in. That's unhelpful. Let's try that again. So the certificate generator uses either our federated logins or Google. We actually have support for any of the OIDC providers. Let's see this. And when that logs in, unfortunately, it's not popping up the window so you can see it. It actually creates a timed SSH cert based on that Oauth that it's carried through. And it's taken the person's email address and identity, and then they map that through our system. So from the user point of view, when they log in, on the side here, they'll have multiple sites. So we're running 3 or 4 sites. At the moment, this particular site's only configured to show 1. When we use this, I'm interested in how we could have say a file ingest app or something like that, where I can click on the side here, for example, this, and instead of what we see here, I have the bits and pieces I need to, so that I can run the Globus parts.
Mm-hmm. So does the user, it looked to me like the user has 2 choices for logging in. Is that right? Now?
How about I'll see if I do it this way.
Let me put it this way. Do your users have multiple identities in your application, or do they have a single identity in your application?
I think from the user point of view, they only have 1 identity. From my point of view, they can have identities on all of the systems they have access to.
Okay, and you control that, or they control that?
I control that.
Okay. So you basically are issuing identities to them on these other systems based on the identity that they log in with.
Yep.
Okay, gotcha.
Thanks. There's my Oauth. Just give me a sec. I got to grab my phone.
Oh.
It almost sounds like, Lance, are you trying to see if you can use your SSH cert for Globus transfers?
Well, at the moment, the SSH cert is used for transfers. So what I'm really interested in is, because this is a national/international project, what I want to do is, how do I allow people to use Globus to pull data in and out of the portal, in and out of the HPC sites that are attached to this portal? And my preference is to try to have them not log in 82 times for all of the different pieces, because we were doing that in the past. And I finally got this bit so that I don't have to do that now. And I'm like, well, I need a data transfer part. What does that look like?
That's a great sharing use case.
Yes, it is. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you want to do it, Josh? It's a mess, or do
No, you
want
go
me to do
ahead.
it?
Go ahead.
Okay. So the way that we would do that, in Globus, if we were, had never seen this before and we just needed to set it up from scratch, is we would tell each of the sites to install Globus Connect server. So each of the sites would have Globus Connect server installed on it. And then each of the administrators, the simplest way to do it would be for each of the administrators to create a guest collection. And that way they could then assign permissions to anybody who has a Globus identity, or anybody that has an identity that Globus knows about. And what that would then allow you to do is, for the web application, the user would log in using Globus, just like I showed with the Modern Research Data Portal. And that the identity that they log in with would need to be added to the access control list for the guest collections at all the 50 sites. So basically they would log in with their one identity, and that same identity is what would allow them then to access the data at the other sites. So rather than using SSH keys to do this, you're using their identity in Globus. Does that?
And you could do the management using Globus groups, which would also simplify it greatly. So you could have a group for each of those sites and drop people into that. So there's, lots of nuances to that, but that's the basic flow. Because that way it's a one time, but it's an administrative minor headache, but then the user experience is pretty seamless.
But that will require that basically Lance replace his current SSH sort of setup with the Globus one. Is there a solution where he can add the Globus piece without? I'm asking because I might have a use case that's similar.
Well, the SSH thing doesn't have to be replaced by this, right? These can live side by side, because as long as you're logging in with Globus such that Globus Auth has an identity that you can then use to check if that, someone has access, if they're on the access control list for that endpoint. Whatever you're doing on the SSH side, go ahead.
So you're already allowing people to log in with Google. Adding Globus Auth as another option would essentially enable transfers with Globus. And once they log in with Globus Auth, you can do the same SSH key setting up that you're doing if you want to continue doing that. It would just basically be another way for you to authorize the transfers and authorize them using Globus. So whether you wanted to replace Google with Globus, something you need to be aware of is that you can also log into Globus using Google. And so, you could actually replace the Google button on your app with Globus. And if the only ID that somebody had was a Google ID, they could just select Google when they get to Globus. Or you could leave it there. And if they pick the Google one, they don't get the ability to transfer things with Globus, whereas if they log in with Globus, they do.
Right. Okay. So I think that was the part that was missing from trying to figure out the question is, if I get the Oauth tokens through some other mechanism, can I use them to interact with Globus Auth without the user interacting with Globus Auth? So the way that we're doing it now is I get the user to interact with their login once, and then I'm using that for all of the parts, whether that be the SSH cert generation or the other bits and pieces I need to do on behalf of the users.
Yeah, so if you want a Globus access token to do transfers, the user has to do that, and the reason is because the user has to consent. And that's the only way that the user has the opportunity to do that consent, to allow the application to have the transfer token based on their identity. And so if there's no way for Globus to take a OAuth token that was generated by another service and off of that generate a transfer token.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Was guessing that was the case. I just wanted to make sure that was clear, because when we use the federated login, they do the same thing. They have a user-facing page which says you're agreeing to give up XYZ information to this service so that you can use it, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people have moved on my systems to using Google Auth, because they never get asked that. They just go, do you want to use it? And it goes, yes, bloof. And like there's single sign on, everything's just linked all the way through. Okay, so it sounds like some of the functionality then for my site or my portal would be different depending on how you logged in.
Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty important. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Lance, you know, that user interaction that's required to give permission only happens once. So once they say yes, they don't have to do that each time.
Is that stored as a cookie on the machine? How is that done? Because
no,
I've had this happen
that in Globus.
Sorry,
we keep track of that in Globus. And the reason that we keep track of it in Globus is so that the user can revoke it if necessary. They can basically go back and take back that permission if they wanted to disable it. If they thought maybe somebody got a hold of their browser or something and they wanted to, disable it remotely.
Yeah, you can look at if you look at this is essentially what it looks like once you've given consent. This is what Globus will store. This is everything I've given consent to, and then I can go and say no. Mona wasn't nice to me, so I'm going to revoke my Cosmic 2 consent.
I suppose the other thing I wanted to talk through then, so on the portal I was showing, every one of those apps on the side uses that SSH key to interact with the server. So it's actually a single platform application on someone's machine. The way that you're talking about doing Globus is that instead of having an SSH that you've got a JSON struct with all of the login information. So I could do something similar there, but just with using the Globus Auth things.
Yeah, you should be able to. Devil's always in the details. So what attributes are in the thing matter. So yeah.
Okay. Because we've just started a what do you call it? National trial with you with ARNet, and so I've got some use cases for large data producing instruments like synchrotrons and things like this, and I'm trying to figure out how to enhance that functionality, because it's easy enough for us to bring up endpoints. The challenging part is actually making those endpoints useful in the analysis environment, so that the scientists that are often using those things, they're not, they range from like really serious physicists who can use computers better than I can to people who are struggling to tie their shoelaces, and having the long tail part, having it all in one place really makes a lot of sense. That's what we're trying to get to.
Yeah, and I'm actually, I'm steeped in the ARNet discussions with Ryan and Karina and everyone. So I'd be happy to spend more time with you on that. Actually, some of the things that both Lee and I are going to cover in the second half of this thing will speak to those types of use cases. So Lee's going to talk about ingest, which is our classic use case, is pull data from a synchrotron or a next-gen sequencer or a cryo-EM. And they all work kind of the same way. You attach metadata, put them somewhere. I'm going to talk about sort of once you have that, what's a nice way to distribute it. So we're almost doing it backwards now that I think about it, Lee, but that's fine. But yeah, we have lots and lots of examples of people doing these kinds of things with their own unique twist to them. So I'd be happy to set separate time aside. We can chat. yeah, I have very little to do after 8 p.m. US Central Time, so that's a good time to catch up with my Australian and New Zealand folks.
So, Lance, if I may, we also have a gateway where the users are fairly, they may not be computer savvy, and I think it does sort of come down to an education of our user as well. What we have decided, we have code in our gateway that does not take the user out to the Globus help page. We did that sort of on purpose, although that is a nice feature. We wanted to make sure that the user doesn't get confused going into another site. And even with that, users still had issues trying to understand this whole endpoint and transfer stuff. So we've actually done little short video tutorials that tells them this is where you point, this is what's happening. And that might be something you guys may also want to consider. That's been helpful to our users.
I'd be very interested to see that, because I mean, that's one of my big pushes. I came from more of an education background, so it's always frustrating when you see, oh, that'd be a really nice way of showing our community how to do that. Because I mean, a lot of them are pretty motivated. If you give them, you've only got to give them a few crumbs and they will chase it down because they want to get their research done.
Right, exactly. Ours is the same. You know, our data set is in the terabyte ranges. And so the users are usually, if they're not computer savvy, they don't even know what to do with that data or how to handle it. And so we're basically offering that we'll manage that for them, do the job submission to the HPC, and then all they get back is the data that they wanted. So they're very motivated to do that. And once they go through the tutorial process, a little bit of pain up front, then they know what to do. Then it's not an issue, but it's always that sort of initial trying to get the user to do something that they haven't done before, and they get confused and then stuck, and then, you know. So we find that the little short tutorials, like 5 minutes or so, is very helpful.
Yeah, and Lance, the other thing I will mention, which we're not going to cover today, is we have a whole bunch of work that we're doing on automation around these types of flows. And we actually have a lot of them already in sort of limited production, if you will, on some of the beam lines at Argonne and a couple other places. So if you're looking to do more of that, right, because again, the user experience is great if they don't even have to be in the loop, right, ultimately. So if you can automate everything up to the point where the user actually needs to pull their data specific, you know, on their own specifically to do something with it, that's ideal, I would think. So we have quite a few cases of where we've done that, and we can again talk offline about, you know, what goes into that. We are looking for, not actively because we have a lot of work already, but we are looking for folks that have these kinds of use cases to start adopting some of these automation services and putting them through their paces. So there might be something that we can explore together.
I'm pretty keen on that. We already do a lot of that for our latest light sheet microscopes and cryo and other bits and pieces. So there's a whole variety of tools we're using for that. I'm pretty lucky in that I've got fiber installed to nearly all of those. So that's not there hasn't been a real driver. But now, because of doing much more national things, like the more than 1,000 kilometers in SSH just is unhelpful for file transfers.
Yeah, sure.
Especially at any speed. So, I mean, these things are really, I'm very keen to look at.
Okay. So I'll make a point of, I mean, you, of course, welcome to hit me with email. I'll reach out to you. Probably won't be next week because I'm out, but the week after we can set up some time and we can do more of a deep dive on some of this stuff.
Okay, that'd be really good. Thank you.
And Vas, I think you know our use case, and we're also interested in that automation thing as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're trying to. So right now, we've got 3 minutes. I'll just say briefly. So we're at a point where we've built, sort of handcrafted, if you will, a few of these pipelines, these automation flows. They're at the point where others can build them somewhat with a lot of hand holding from us. That last mile problem, which is, you know, how do you talk to the instrument? What happens at that point of sort of ingest into the rest of the flow? that's still, that can get tricky because, cryo-EM, a lot of them are still Windows-based things. And so there's all sorts of crafty pieces that don't play well at scale. So yeah, but again, I'm happy to share some of our experiences to date and see how we can help.
Right, sounds good. I'm going to try and go and grab a cup of tea before this starts back up again.
Yeah, might not be
Yeah.
a bad idea to stand up at least.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go and grab water before I start talking again. So I'll see you guys in a bit.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Just in the interest of staying on time here. So this session is going to dive into another very, very common use case. Actually, we were just talking about a little bit of this earlier during the break. So the general use case is one of what we generalize as data distribution. It takes a number of different forms, but the basic premise is sort of similar across all these different use cases, which is you have some type of either repository where you are delivering, let's say, reference data sets to some community. Perhaps you're in climate research, or you've got a telescope observation data or something that is shared by a very large community, typically distributed around the world. And then the other very common use case is you're pulling data from some type of instrument, a light source, next-gen sequencer, a cryo-EM, Zeiss light sheet or something like that. And in all of these shared instrument use cases, you have multiple, if you will, users, consumers of the instrument. So you want to typically distribute data with some access controls to specific users or groups of users, PIs or their labs or what have you. So we see this over and over, and people have built many science gateways and portals and other web apps that enable this kind of data distribution flow. So the design pattern, if you will, is sort of summarized on this slide here. So you've got the science gateway that typically allows you to perform some kind of search to discover the things the data you're looking for. And in doing so, it may enforce some security and access control, depending on what data you can or can't access. It might not even show you that in search. It might not even allow you to search certain types of metadata based on who you are. So that's kind of a critical piece. It's not just the data, it's also the metadata, right, that needs to be protected in many instances. And then it typically provides a couple different modes for pulling data down, as Lee showed in the modern research data portal example, right? You can do HTTPS sort of right through the browser for small single files, or you can fire off asynchronous transfer. So the one example that we talk about quite a bit, and it just so happens it was really the first really major one for us, was that of the NCAR Research Data Archive. So NCAR, for those not familiar, right, they provide, among other things, reference data for climate research. It's atmospheric data, agricultural data, all sorts of stuff. And they have literally tens of petabytes of these curated data sets with really well, they're really well described. They've got very good extensive metadata, so you can search for them and discover them from different facets. And they do this obviously so that you've got referenceable things, right? Most of these data sets have DOIs or other persistent identifiers, so they can be cited in the researchers' publications and so on. And what they needed was a mechanism to make this data much more easy for folks to firstly find, but more importantly, to pull down to their own systems for downstream analysis and whatever else, building their models and so on. And originally they had a fairly manual intensive process where you would find the thing you wanted, then you would request it, then they would sort of package it, they'd put it somewhere for you. You would get a special link through SSH, you'd go log in, you'd have your own, you have to download a client, do all sorts of weird things. And it was very cumbersome. And then about, I don't know, maybe it's been maybe 4 or maybe 5 years ago now, they were, as I said, one of the first ones that started using some of these Globus platform services, and then they added them to their research data archive. They still kept some of the other mechanisms, but they added this, and this actually, I think, grew their usage by something like 30 or 35% within literally the first few months, as far as how much data was being accessed. So that was sort of testament to the ease of use of the thing at minimum. So I'll actually show you what that looks like. I'm going to go over to NCAR RDA. So this is the website. Let me make that a little bigger. So I've actually logged in here. I'm logged in with, I have an account. Anybody can actually, I think if you're affiliated with a nonprofit research group, you can just go get an account, so you can actually check this out for yourself. But I'm in the portal here, and I can go, look for some data. I know nothing about climate science, so I'm just going to randomly find data sets. But I guess here's as good as any a data set, right? So I'll click on this data set. It tells me, as I said, there's a lot of metadata. So there's a description, and then there's a bunch of metadata down here. And also importantly, tells me how big this data set is. So this is a pretty sizable one, 120 terabytes odd. Usually I might not want all of this, but when I click on this data access tab, you'll see that I can go look at the various subsets or collections of files within this data set, or I can actually go ahead and just download it, pull it down using Globus Transfer. So when I do that, it actually does the following, right? It puts up this message. Make that a little bigger. It doesn't look like I can grow that. So if you can't read that, it's basically saying just click here to request a transfer. You don't need a Globus account. You can log into Globus using your research data archive credentials, right? And then you can just pull the data down. So again, this is facilitated by the federated login that both Lee and I have shown now. So the user doesn't need a Globus account. They just go in, they say, yep, I want to access this via Globus. So it will log them in with their RDA credentials, right? So now it puts up this weird looking link. This is actually a link to a guest collection or a shared endpoint that is on Globus and contains the data. So if I go and click on that, right, it'll drop me into Globus. Oops, let me just make that a little bigger here. And I'm in that data set 345.0, which I think, right, so that's the data set right there. So assuming I know what I want, I didn't bother with the search there, but I can go in here, I can explore and find the specific bits of data that I want. Say I want to move it to some other server. I always like moving to Petrel because that's a nice petascale sort of storage space for us. Start, and that's it. So I've got my data, right? And again, this is front ending. I don't know. I think it's probably upwards of 20 or 30 petabytes now. It's certainly many tens of petabytes of data. And this pattern is very common, not just for these kind of reference data sets, as I said, but also for instrument and those kinds of use cases. So what I'd like to do is just talk about what we need if we want to do this within our own science gateways here, right? So the things we need at a minimum are a shared collection, a guest collection, a shared endpoint. I use these terms interchangeably, as I said earlier, because that's the thing that allows me as a system administrator or as the data curator, manager, what have you, to control in a very fine-grained way who has access to what parts of this larger data set or the data that's coming off the instrument. And I can do that by, again, setting access controls through Globus. I obviously need the Science Gateway, but in particular, I need the Science Gateway client, the thing that you register with Globus Auth as your Science Gateway application. That identity that Lee pointed out, that UUID at clients.auth.globus.org, that sort of user, that non-human user, needs to be made an access manager on this guest collection, the shared collection, and that's because the gateway itself is now going to manage the access permissions on behalf of the user and of Globus, right? So the access manager role grants the client or any user, actually, I could grant access manager roles to human users, which is probably a lot more common, but it grants whoever has this access manager role can then set and revoke permissions on that shared data. The other thing we may need, depending on your use case, I usually advise that you do use groups, Globus groups. That is, you define a Globus group because it makes the data management a lot simpler. It is optional. You could sort of manually or for each user set specific access permissions, but doing it this way means you can create a group, give the group permission to the data, and then by virtue of adding members, a user as a group member, or taking them, or revoking their access to the group, they then get access or not to the underlying data. And this is actually, there's another handy use case for this if you do use groups, which is we see a lot of cases where, for instance, on a cryo-EM microscope or a next-gen sequencer, the PI, the lab, the lead researcher for a lab is the person that sort of gets access to the data, but then that person typically wants to have other people in their team access the data as well. So rather than have the administrator of the data transfer node or the endpoint on that instrument or what have you, do all that for each individual user as postdocs come and go and grad students show up, what have you. What they can do is they can grant the access manager role to that PI, to that researcher, and then that person can also further manage access controls within their group. So it's actually kind of a nice self-service mechanism that takes the burden off the system administrator and lets the user feel like they have much more control over who's getting to their data.
Bas, can I ask you a question about
Yeah,
that?
please.
With the client, with the Globus client ID account for an application, can I allow another application with a Globus client ID access to an endpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, these are all, at the end of the day, it's sort of, to quote it's turtles all the way down, it's UUIDs all the way down. You can, any UUID that's recognized by Globus Auth as a valid identity, whether it belongs to an app client or a human or something else, is treated the same way. Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So those are the three sort of resource types that you need. And then, we have to write a little bit of code to actually move the data to the shared collection. And then, as I said, there's a couple of different ways to grant access, right? We could either do it through the group mechanism or grant access directly to the user's identity. I think I actually have these switched around in my code, but I'll fix that before I share the slides. And then Another requirement that's quite common, I think, especially on the instruments, because there's limited space on these devices where the data ends up, they want to be able to clean up that staging area where the data sit, so that the next experiment can come online and so on. So you typically would want to write some code that looks at who's done a transfer, if it was successful. Sometimes the rule that people apply is, if more than one or at least one successful transfer has occurred, they assume that the data is good to go. That can be dangerous. Usually there's some human to and fro about that, but sometimes they'll say this is available for the next week or 2 weeks, and at that point then they just go and revoke those permissions to that shared collection, that guest collection, and then typically wipe it, so the next data run can put its data there. So those are the various bits. Again, I mentioned this briefly in the introduction, but I want to stress this point about how the sharing permissions actually work. So if you look at the endpoint itself, there are underlying file system permissions that are set by the administrator, and you can see that's squarely in the domain of the subscriber, yourself, the end user system administrator. Globus doesn't change those. Instead, what Globus does is, on this shared endpoint or guest collection, we create these, there's this access control list that says who can access what on this endpoint, on behalf or as whom, masquerading as whom. So what really happens behind the scenes here is, when I shared with you on that HPC cluster, on our Midway cluster, what happens is, if any of you go and access that guest collection from the perspective of that HPC cluster, from that storage system, it looks like it's me, like Vas at UChicago, that's accessing the data, because I'm the one that has local account access. So the sort of incentives, actually in some ways, it's sort of an adjacent incentive, if you will, to the researcher to be really careful about whom they share with, because it actually sort of in logs and things like that, it looks like they're doing it. We also track, by the way, logs of which actual Globus users touch those shared endpoints. So you do have that level of audit trail if you need it, to see who actually accessed shared data.
Incidentally, that is why we sometimes call these guest collections, because really what's happening here is that you are giving guest access to somebody else, to something that you have permission to yourself. So it's kind of the same thing as having an escorted guest in your building. If you have a secure building and you're allowed to bring them in, and you swipe your badge, but you bring both yourself and them into the building.
Right.
And you take on responsibility for that yourself.
Right. Yep, exactly. So, so what I'm going to do here again now is go back to our Jupyter Hub. And again, you're more than welcome to follow along here. So this time I'm going to open up this notebook called Data Distribution. And I'm going to do essentially what I just described on that previous slide, a couple slides ago, right? I'm going to, firstly, I'm going to get some tokens, right? Because I always need auth tokens to allow me to access the various Globus platform services and the APIs, right? So in this case, I'm going to get the tokens directly from the Jupyter environment. So I showed this briefly before the break, right? Well, they're stored in the environment. All I'm doing is I'm just accessing them, sort of unpickling them, and then I can look at the various tokens that I have access to, right? So in particular, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to the transfer service. I'm going to use this access token, and I'm also going to talk to the groups service, which is actually one of the new APIs that we added. This has been a long time coming. So I'm going to use this access token as well. But I'm just showing them here, just FYI. You don't need to worry about them. If you understand what that structure looks like, then you can just go ahead and access it. So here I just have a little block just to illustrate how you can actually find an identity. So I mentioned in the other talk that the primary identity is often the one that you end up using, because that's, for most people that just have one identity, that's one and the same. For the others that have linked identities, it's usually helpful to use their primary identity, although it's not required. So I'm going to take the primary identity. In my case, I'll pull that out of my identity set that was as part of that token package that came back. So that's my primary identity. And it just so happens that's the email associated with it. And I want to pause here just to describe this, because even though this thing here looks, this first line, VAS@Globus ID, even though that looks like an email and identity are not one and the same. An identity is this thing within Globus Auth, right, that has a link, sort of a indirect link to some identity providers, right? So it has a username that's been issued by an identity provider. In this case, the identity provider is Globus ID, right, at this domain. It just so happens that with that identity, I've associated an email, which is my VAS@UChicago email, so that if I need to get notified or something with respect to that identity, that's where emails will go, right? In fact, there is no email. I don't have a VAS@globusid.org email address. I have a VAS@globus.org, but these two things are completely different. They just happen. Sometimes it's confusing because people see the syntax here and they think it's one and the same. But you can think of this as username VAS@identity provider globusid.org. That's what that means. That's the identity. Okay. So so back to my, yeah, go ahead.
So can the identity also be vas@uchicago.edu if you are authenticating with a Chicago institutional login?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very important point to point out. Thank you. So here I had logged into this Jupyter Hub with this identity. Actually, I logged in. I've got a whole set of identities, but I just chose this one because it's the primary. In fact, I'll show you where that is. If I go up here and look at my token package, in the bottom here is my identity set, and here is where are we? Yeah,
It was the very
right. So here they all say Organization University of Chicago. That's another thing, right? So don't be fooled. That's my employer. So I have an identity that is University of Chicago, but that's my personal email, which I probably shouldn't show you here. But so here is my actual University of Chicago identity, right? The identity provider display name, so that you can tell that it's from the University of Chicago IDP. And then this is the thing that matters. This is actually the identity ID. It's called sub. That's just an OAuth term. But so that's my username. In this case, it's vas@this identity provider, uchicago.edu. And actually, this is another interesting one. So you saw me logged into NCAR. So I have an NCAR identity in the RDA, right? This is my identity for NCAR. It's got 2 @ in it, which seems kind of weird. But if you go back to what I just described, right? The first part, this part here, vas@uchicago, is my username that I logged into to NCAR with, right up here. You can see it. It's right up there, vas@uchicago, right? And this is the identity provider. It's the UCAR, rda.ucar.edu identity provider that provided that for me. And you'll notice again here, there is no email associated with this, right? That identity provider doesn't require me to give them an email, and I haven't. Okay. So where were we? So we ran that one. Right, so the next thing we'd like to do is, so we've got data that's come off the instrument, and we want to put it somewhere for a user to access. Or we've got this massive, in the case of the RDA, this massive petascale thing, and we want to give access to just some subset of that to a user. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create what I'm calling the data distribution directory. This is some part of the file system on some endpoint somewhere. that is going to act as our shared collection that we will then grant permissions to for individual users and for groups. I'll show both cases. So this is the shared endpoint ID that I'm using. It's that same petrol test bed endpoint that I showed in a couple other demos earlier. An important point here is that this must already exist. So you need to create the guest collection of the shared endpoint sort of outside of the app. This is not something you can do on the fly because that requires an actual user with an actual local account with local account access to create that collection, that guest collection. But once you have that created, you can go get the ID, the UUID for that endpoint. Lee showed you how to do that. And then within that, what I've done is I've created just arbitrarily a directory called distribution home, dist home, which is where I'm going to then create subdirectories for each of my users, let's say, of the microscope or of the next-gen sequencer. So just to sort of come at this from another perspective, right? If I look at it through the web app, here is the petrol data endpoint. Here is dist home. And I think this was actually me testing 4:46 a.m. Yep, that was certainly me. So just get rid of that. But this is the sort of, if you will, the virtual root, the place on that storage system where I'm going to create potentially multiple different guest collections for individual users. I'm going to grant access to different PIs, however your structure, projects, right? There's different ways to do it depending on your organizational setup. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create the directory and then I'm going to transfer, I'm going to move the files into there. So first thing I'm going to do is create the directory. So I'm getting a transfer client. So you saw this previously, right? So I'm using the transfer API globus.org access token. I'm accessing the transfer service, creating a transfer client, and then I'm using that client to do a make dir operation, right? And I'm going to make the directory on the shared endpoint ID on this one here. And the path is user path, which I'm defining as the root directory plus the identity ID. So this is another common approach is instead of trying to figure out what to call every directory, a nice clean way, at least from the developer's perspective, is to use the UUID of that user's identity. So up here, I didn't point it out, but I did pull the identity ID for my primary identity. So I'm going to use that. So what we're going to see is if we run this, if each of you go ahead and run this, which you should be able to, I think you all have permissions there, if I've set it up correctly, you will see directories created using your own UUID. So I'm going to run that cell. And if all goes well, it'll tell me the directory was created. So if I go back here and reload that, I should see, right, this is my primary identity ID actually. So that's my own little sort of folder within that general distribution structure. And now, again, from the standpoint of the data manager, system administrator, I'm going to put the files that the user requested or the files that came off the microscope into that directory. So, right, so what am I doing here? This is just a straight transfer from the source endpoint, which in this case, I'm just using one of the tutorial endpoints just with a couple of files. This would be your instrument, your light source, data transfer node, what have you. So you tell it again, the endpoint ID and where the data are on that endpoint. In this case, I'm giving it a label so I can just find it easily in my activity. And Lee showed you in the MRDP code how you create one of these transfer data objects. So I'm transferring from source endpoint to shared endpoint with this label. And then I'm adding to that one transfer request, which is from source path to user path, which is, again, that same directory we just created. Right, I'm going to do it recursively, so everything that's in that source path gets dropped into that user's special directory for sharing. So when I run that, it's going to submit the transfer ID here, the transfer request, and I'm going to get back a transfer ID. And I can go and look at that ID. I could obviously look at it programmatically, but I can also go here look at it, and you'll see it's running there, right? So data distribution staging. It's going to run for a couple seconds because there's just a few files there, and the files will show up. So if I go back to my file manager actually and refresh, right there are my 3 files. So just to recap, what we've done so far is we've created a directory just for this project, this user, this microscope run, what have you, and we've put the files in that directory for that run project user. Now we're going to grant access to the PI, the lab group, or however you've structured this. So the first approach that I'm going to use to do that is to just grant access to the user directly. So I will walk you through what I'm doing here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give read-only access. So this is the document that I use in essentially my post request. So I'm posting to the transfer service, and I ask it to add an endpoint ACL rule, right? So I'm going to add to the access control list this rule. Whoops, I need to edit that. And so the rule says permissions set to read only, right? I only want people pulling data off this endpoint. I don't want them writing or deleting anything. I'm going to grant access to this identity ID. Again, this is the user's primary identity. And the type of identity that I'm granting it to is an identity. It's a single identity versus a group. So there's 2 different modes. I'll show you the group one in just a second. And I'm granting access, this read-only access, to that user path that we created, that specific directory only. Okay, so when I run that, it's gonna make this call. If it succeeds, it will assign an access rule ID. So basically, this new entry in the access control list has its own unique ID. It's actually a separate resource. You can manage this ACL. You can change it, so you could upgrade it from read only to read write, or vice versa. And it's important to keep these. I mean, you can get to them if you want after the fact, but I'm saving it here because I want to go back and revoke access right at the end of this flow. So so I'm going to run this, and right, it tells me, so it's succeeded, right? Created, access rule created on this resource, endpoint, and that's the endpoint. And then that's the mode. So this is the endpoint here. You'll see it. That's the endpoint ID up here. You can't really see it. Sorry, it's a little small. So now this identity ID, which happens to be me, has access to that endpoint. Okay. So let me pause there. Any questions? I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you folks right now. Just want to make sure. Yeah.
Can you remind me who owns this endpoint? Who gave you permission again?
Great question. So what I didn't show you, what was sort of happened behind the magic curtain is, so the endpoint is owned by someone, whoever. In this case, it's someone at Argonne that manages the storage. What they did is they gave Access Manager access to this application. So let me show you where that is. And actually I'm glad you asked that, because I meant to show you that, but I didn't. So on this endpoint, this is the actual underlying endpoint petrol test bed. There is permissions granted to, let me see if I can, I thought I had it up here. Hang on a sec. Yeah, you can see this is a pretty busy endpoint. Somewhere in here is my,
Oh, are you looking for dist home?
yeah, let me see, where is it?
There's dist home.
Yeah, right. Well, actually, this is the permission I just added, by the way, right? So this this permission here, you can see it's read only. This first checkbox, this check, that's the the permission I just added. Dist home slash, and then this is my identity ID. For some reason, I'm not showing how the portal has access manager rights to this. I think it's actually through the tutorial users group. I don't want to.
Yeah,
I don't want to derail this too much. But let me see. I suspect the portal is. Okay, somewhere I'm forgetting where I set access for this because I've done it. I did it so long ago. But your point is a very important one. Your Science Gateway needs to show up as an access manager. This thing here, an M that says this entity, this application, the Science Gateway, is allowed to manage the permissions on this shared endpoint. So that needs to be done, and that I made that assumption up front. In fact, I hope that I put that in the notes, but I will. I'll go back and make sure that I've described that in a bit more detail in this notebook. Right. So the portal, basically, the Science Gateway here is, well, which is just our notebook in this case, is able to manage these permissions. It can grant the permissions to a user. This next step, it's actually granting them to a group of users. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm going. This is just a nice snippet to see how I access the auth service itself. So so far we've been accessing just the transfer service. Here I'm accessing the auth service because what I want to do is create. I'm going to manually create a request to talk to the groups service. The groups API doesn't yet have all the nice wrappers in the Globus SDK. Some things are there, but not everything. So in this case, I want to add an identity to a group. I want to add a user to a group because the group has access. So I'm going to create a header, which is just a, authorization header with a bearer token, right? So I'm taking the group's token and putting it there. This is the group that I want to add the user to. So this group, it's some random group that I created, directed Omics translation, whatever that means. That group already has access to the shared endpoint. So that group has read access to the endpoint. So any user I add to this group will automatically have read access, right? And in this case, I'm adding a user whose username is globus@demodoc@gmail.com. And again, remember, we want to usually most of these commands accept the user identity ID. In some cases, they'll also accept the username and they'll translate between the two. But here, I'm showing you how you can get the user's identity from their username. So this is the username, right? This is a Gmail, Google account, basically, that I used for demo purposes. So I get the user's identity, and then in this complicated looking request, I'll break it down for you. I'm calling the group service, and I'm posting to this group, the sharing group ID, right? I'm adding, so here's the add command in the body of the request. I'm adding an identity ID, which is this identities, it came from this call here, identities0.id. So that's this user's primary identity ID that I'm adding. Right, so that's all I'm doing here. It's kind of long-winded, but I put this in here because it gives you a little bit of a deeper understanding, hopefully an example of how these different services fit together. So once I run this, what will happen is that user gets added to the group. So they're just a regular member. There are other roles you can have, manager, admin, etc., but they're just a member in this case. The status is active. So if I go to my groups here and I look at that, where's that directed Omics group, right? There is this demo that this user that I just added. It actually says they've been a member for 12 hours. That's because I've been adding them and removing them while I've been testing this notebook for the past 12 hours. So yeah, so that's the other way to do this, right? Add the individual user to the access control list, or add the user or users to a group that is, or that already has access to that guest collection. And by the way, the same way that I added this individual user, I could have added the group itself to begin with. I just happened to do that offline. I didn't want to sort of repeat this thing too many times, just gets more confusing, but you could just as easily automatically add the group and then add and remove users from the group. Okay.
Another question about this group thing.
Yeah.
You mentioned that it's a fairly new addition. Does it require a certain version of the Globus software to do the grouping thing?
No, actually so groups as a service has been in Globus since the very early days. So the groups service itself is not new. What's new is this public API that allows me to automatically add users and check their membership and so on. That's something we released some few months ago. And no, it doesn't require any specific version of Globus Connect or anything. It's just another Globus service. You call it. Currently, the APIs are in version 2. You can see down here. So that's it. That's all you need to do.
Okay,
And
thanks.
it's the docs are in the same place as all the other APIs, and at least put links to those in the resources document. Right. So I've talked a lot about what I've been doing, but really I've done 3 very simple things. I've created a directory within this the shared endpoint. I've put some files there that are just for this specific user or the specific group, and then I've granted access to that user or group in this using one of these 2 different modes. So now, downstream from there, some point later, the user has pulled their file. So I'm making the assumption here that the Science Gateway is tracking the transfers, or you're revoking the permissions after some period of time and so on. So once you want to get rid of that access, right, the user's done or the experiment's over and you want to free up that space, first thing we want to do is remove the access permission. So we want to get rid of that rule that we added to the access control list. So this is where I go back to that rule ID that I stored here just to make it easy for us. I don't have to go look it up. So I can just make this call, and just same as we did an add, we're doing a delete endpoint ACL, right? So we remove the rule, right? And so now that user no longer has access to that endpoint, to that guest collection. And then presumably, we want to clean up that staging area, that storage where all these files were sitting. So I'm just going to call the transfer service again and now I'm actually going to submit a delete request. So far, in all the examples, we've been submitting transfer requests. A delete request is just another type of request to the transfer service, except it's just touching the one endpoint and deleting stuff, right? And it's the same thing. It works the same way. Instead of a transfer data object, there's a delete data object. And I add the thing I want to delete. In this case, I'm just giving it the path. And I'm going to delete everything in that directory because I've set recursive equals to true. And that's it. The rest of the flow is the same. I auto-activate the endpoint. I submit the task. So when I do that, it'll just basically delete that directory, get rid of it. And now when I go back to the endpoint, I should see that that petrol in that petrol endpoint. Oops, in the file manager, I should see that. Yeah, right. So that directory is gone now from dist home. So that's sort of the full flow. And again, this pattern is applicable to many different use cases out there, instruments, repositories, other things. So I realize I'm a little over time here, actually. Sorry about that. But yeah, I'm happy to take any more questions here. Okay. I am going to hand this over to Lee. Lee, I was going to show petrol data as the final resting place for some of the stuff, but I think you're going to cover that. So I'm just going to leave that if that's okay.
I noticed that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
So let's see, I'm going to share my desktop because I'm going to be bouncing around a few windows here. Okay, so we're switching to part 4, which is the last of our 3 major scenarios here. And again, I'm going to start out by describing the scenario a bit and pointing out what's difficult about it. And then showing you an example of a website that does what, that basically does this scenario very nicely. And then I'll walk you through the code that makes it work. I want to remind you that the resources tab is available to you in KikoChat. I hope you've all found that. We're moving now from part 3 to part 4, and there's a bunch of new links there that I'll be using. And feel free to stop me if I get a little bit ahead of things and you need me to back up a little bit. That's totally fine with me. Hopefully Vass will be watching in the chat for your questions, or you can just unmute and go ahead and ask me. So the topic of this section is data ingests. And what I mean by that, let me go into, there we go. What I mean by that is gathering data sets from research partners. The scenario here is that you have a project that's gathering data sets from partners. They may be big, they may be small, doesn't really matter. But you need to have a way to allow your partners to transfer the data sets to a common data store, some warehouse that your project is maintaining. But then that's not the end of the story. So getting the data there is just the first step. In order for the data to be useful, you also need to have the partners describe their data sets so that ultimately everybody who's a member of the team, or at least those people who have a particular job in the team, are able to find out what data sets have been collected, and are any of those data sets that might be interesting for a particular research question to be answered. So we need to also add descriptive metadata, and we also need to be able to use the metadata that's been collected to get a high-level view of what's in the collection, all the data sets as a large set, and then be able to search among all that metadata to find particular data sets that might be interesting for a particular research question. So that's the high-level overview of this scenario. What are some of the challenges that you as a gateway developer would have when trying to implement this for a gateway? The first one is one we've already talked about, getting the large data sets transferred from the user system to the central repository. So I talked about that in the first scenario about how you would set up, how you would basically set up the transfer. And I'm not going to repeat that here. The next interesting challenge you have is generating a persistent identifier for the data in the central repository. Why do we need a persistent identifier for the data in the central repository? It's so that we can link the metadata or the descriptions of the data set to the specific files, so that when we do some browsing of the metadata or searching in the metadata, and we say, aha, it looks like data set 345 is the one that I want, I can actually then find the files on my data store that are related to data set 345. And we also, in case we have to move some data around or reshuffle things in the data repository, we want to have a persistent identifier that can be updated so that nothing in the index needs to be changed. I just move the data around and I update the identifier so that it has an updated reference to the data files. We also need a place to store the metadata. So there's two things we're storing here. We're storing both the data sets, and we're also storing the metadata that describes the data sets. And so we need a place to put all that metadata. And then finally, we need to be able to index the metadata so that it's searchable. When you make metadata searchable, you often have to do a process called indexing. That means basically building up tables so that when somebody enters a search term, or when somebody says, I only want data sets that have this particular tag associated with it, for example, the answer comes back really fast. And your gateway can basically say, okay, it's these 20,000 data sets that are related to that particular tab. And you don't have to do a search over 1 million data sets every time somebody does that. So those are the things that the kind of the sub problems that we have to solve. And I'll show you ways that you can do that. First of all, though, I want to show you a website that does this so that you see in more concrete detail what I'm talking about. I'm going to use a website called petroldata.net. This is data that is stored on, or data projects that are storing data on a system called Petrol. Petrol is a system at Argonne National Laboratory, and it has about 3 petabytes of data that it is making available on a self-service basis for projects. Projects can apply for, I think it's 100 terabytes of storage on Petrol. And when they get the data on Petrol, they're able to manage access to it for their own project team, pretty much self-service. So as far as the Petrol system administrators are concerned, there's one PI for each project, and they create a guest collection for that PI with a quota of 100 terabytes. And they create a group for that PI, and they make the PI an access manager for the group, and they make the PI an access manager for the guest collection. And from then on, it's pretty much the PI's job to manage access to this for their project. These are some of the projects that are currently hosted on Petrol Data. And these are the ones that are using this search, the search feature that I'm going to show you. And so one of them in particular that I wanted to highlight for you was the Materials Data Facility. The Materials Data Facility is a project at Argonne, but also at other institutions, that is gathering large amounts of data sets related to material science. And so some of it's microscopy data, some of it is simulation data, some of it's experiment data, things like, breaking materials or, testing materials, breaking them and seeing what, interesting things happen to them. Do they explode? Do they crush? Do they bend? All that kind of stuff. What you see when you go to this project on Petrol is a browse, kind of a high-level browse interface and a search interface all in one page. And you can see here at the very top that right now in the materials data facility, there are almost a million records. Those are basically individual pieces of data, and 518 data sets. Those are collections of those records that are all about a particular research project or research problem. The data sets have been tagged. They've been flagged with different organizations that provided the data sets. And they also are categorized by year. So there's a bunch of metadata that's been collected for each of the data sets that allows this browse interface to be populated. And then there's also up here a free text search field. So if I wanted to, for example, narrow the view down to only things related to titanium, I could do that. And you could see that the numbers over here in the facets changed quite a bit. There's only 111 records, only 17 data sets that had titanium mentioned in the metadata. And here they all are. Most of these are records. If I say I only want data sets, then here are all the data sets, all 17 of them that had to do with titanium. Okay, so basically this is a high-level way for the researchers who participate in the materials data facility to get a high-level view of all the data sets that have been collected by their community And oops, I need to change this back to star. And kind of, how diverse are they? And, how many different organizations are there from? Which organizations are pulling their weight and which organizations haven't really contributed much? Maybe, what tags are highly populated and which ones are underpopulated? How have things changed over time? What elements are being discussed in it, et cetera. And it also provides the ability to search down for very fine-grained metadata about these data sets. So let's say that I'm interested then in a data set and I want to grab it. Here is some weathering data for a particular substance. It was generated by an organization in Canada, I think. A little bit unclear to me. I'd have to really look. Oh, EPA Cincinnati. Okay. So basically, this is the data set. Here are instructions for getting access to it using Python. If you're doing things in notebooks, a lot of the researchers here do things in Jupyter notebooks. Or if you want to use the Forge client, you can do that. This is a Python CLI tool that's been provided by the Materials Data Facility. But what I'm interested in is, what if I just want to download the data? I would hit this Globus button and it will take me to an endpoint in Globus. Petrol Research Data Analytics, and it just dumps me into the subfolder for that thing. So all I really have to do now is open up my second panel, pick a place to transfer it, and fire it off. Oops, what am I? Oh, I didn't select anything over here. Duh. Okay, fire it off, and the transfer is now hopefully active. There we go. Yeah, oops, sorry about that. It'll take a couple minutes for that transfer to happen. But basically, I just wanted to show you that this is how people use the Materials Data Facility on Petrol. They use this high-level view with the metadata. They use the records that are in here to link from the metadata into the actual files in Globus, and that requires the persistent identifier. Let's see, was there anything else I wanted to make sure? No, I think that was pretty much the demo that I wanted to give of MDF itself. So now I need to go back to my slides. There they are. Okay, so that's kind of what we're trying to enable. So the question that begs is, how does the data get into Petrol? And how do we get the metadata there? And how do we get a persistent identifier and all the links that we need to build the portal? So what needs to be in place for this to work? First of all, we need data storage, and that's provided by Globus Connect server running on the Petrol system. We need persistent identifiers, and we're getting those from a hosted service that's hosted by Fair Research, the Fair Research Identifier Service. I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. And then we also need metadata storage, indexing, and search. And we're using that on Petrol using the Globus Search API. This is another one of the APIs that Globus provides. It's hosted by us, including the storage for all the metadata. So if you are granted access to use the Globus Search API, you'll get an index that you can use for your own private purposes, and nobody else will be allowed to put things in that index but you. You can then give permissions to the index to other people using Globus groups, and you can start populating it with metadata and not worry about the storage, because we take care of all that for you. We also take care of the indexing and provide a search API that you can use. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. All right, how is Globus Connect server on Petrol set up? I wanted to tell you a little bit about how it's set up. As I mentioned, this is designed for self-service. So the way it works is that if you want to get, and this is all, you can go to the Petrol website if you want to see this all displayed in their nice WordPress documentation. if you want to get access to Petrol as a project, what you do is you request membership in a Globus group. The Globus group is something like Petrol Project Administrators or Petrol Project Organizers or something like that. And you will be asked when you request membership in that group to say what your project is about. And if the organizers think that it sounds plausible and it's a good use of their system, they will create a Globus group for you and they'll create a guest collection for you. And I will mute my phone. There we go. So we use Globus for the authorization and management of everything on there. You'll get a group and you'll get a guest collection. You can do everything you want to that guest collection, giving access permissions to anybody you want, any groups you want, etc. And you're just limited to 100 terabytes for your guest collection. All right, let me talk about fair research identifiers. So the fair research identifier service, the documentation is down here at the bottom of the screen. It's also, Lord, I hope that I got that into the resources. I didn't. Okay, well, I'm going to have to really quickly scramble and put that into the resources page, but it is minid.readthedocs.io en develop. That basically takes you to their Read the Docs site, and it gives you information about their RESTful web service that stores the identifier metadata. So you basically give it metadata, and it, quote unquote, mints you an identifier. That identifier is then resolvable not only through the Fair Research Identifier service, but also through a number of other popular identifier services because it's federated with DO in it. So you basically, with DataCite, you get a DOI. It uses ARCs and it uses the MINID service as its actual, kind of local identifier namespace. With the fair, let me see if I have another, yeah, I do. So basically with the fair research identifier API, you have all these nice REST commands you can do to create namespaces for your project, and then to add or mint identifiers with in a particular namespace. And that basically takes the metadata that you provide and associates it with a new unique identifier. And then it also registers it with all these other name resolvers services so that it can be used. You can put it in papers, you can put it in your code, and it will be resolvable into perpetuity as long as everything's maintained properly. So basically, all this is to say is that there is a REST API for that, and you don't have to write the code to do that other than to access it as a client. I'll show you that in just a second. But before I do that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Globus Search API. The Globus Search API is another API that Globus hosts and operates, just like the Transfer API or the Oauth API that Vas and I have talked about in the earlier sections. What it does is it's a RESTful API for indexing and search of metadata. The way it works basically is that as a user of the Search API, you get an index object, and that index object allows you to manage an index. Every index has entries in it that you add, and every entry has metadata and a subject. The subject is basically a URL or a location in some storage system, and the metadata is all the information about what's there at that particular location. It provides a REST API, a Python client package, so you can import the Search API Python package and then use it in your code. Or we also have a Python CLI that you can use. So if you just want to do things on the command line, maybe management and administration stuff, you can do it on the command line as well. And all the documentation for it is available at docs.globus.org API. That's where all of our APIs are, and then search for the specific Search API. And this is what the documentation looks like. Some of the features of Globus Search that are important, I think will be important to you are, first of all, it's scalable. You can put billions of entries into one of these indexes and still get back snappy search results and faceted, all the faceted information that you need to generate pages that look like this. It's schema agnostic, so you can use any schema that you want. It can be very informal. In fact, in the notebook that I'll show you, we use a really informal metadata schema. You can even use multiple schemas in different entries in the same index, and everything works out fine. It has fine-grained access control, so you can set permissions on indices or on entries. Permissions on an index says who's able to do things like add entries, or maybe even just see the entry, or even know that the entry, or I'm sorry, the index, or know that the index exists. For permissions on entries, it sets the visibility of who is allowed to see that particular entry in their search results. So you can basically make it so that you have an index that has entries in it, some of which that are public and others of which that are restricted access, probably to a group. That's probably the most manageable way to do it. You would provide a group that is able to see a particular entry, and then anybody who's in that group would see that entry show up in their search results. It also supports plain text search and faceted search. The plain text search is for this field right up here, where I typed in titanium and it narrowed everything down to things that had titanium anywhere in the metadata. The faceted search is for this side of things. So basically, when you do a search request using the search API, you can say, I want to see all the facets that come back too, and it'll show you for the fields in the metadata schema, how many of the results that came back matched any of these tags, any of these organizations, whatever is in your metadata schema. It'll break it out for you and give you the counts so that you can populate this table here. And it also has a rich query language that, frankly, I've never gotten into myself, but if you need more information about that, I would refer you to our documentation. Okay, so if you're going to use this system to develop an app, what do you have to have? What are the key ingredients? First of all, you need to have the UUID and the base path for the guest collection where you're gathering your data. So that's the GCS endpoint and the guest collection you've created where data is going to be uploaded. You need to have the minid Python client. So that you'll get from going to the read the docs site, and it'll just tell you which Python package to import. You need the UUID for a search index that you've been given by the Globus search administrators. So you basically go to support@globus.org and say, I'd like a Globus search index for this particular project, and they'll give you back a UUID. And you need to choose for yourself what kind of metadata schema you want to use. The reason I list that as a key ingredient is because it's helpful to have some consistency, even though Globus doesn't require you to use a consistent schema. If you want your displays to look nice and be clean and organized and things, it's helpful if most of the entries in your index use a common schema. And so you'll have to think a little bit about, okay, what fields are we going to want people to search by, and what facets do we want to have on the side? So that we know what things to put into our metadata schema up front. Again, it's not required to use Globus Search to have a consistent schema, but your gateway will probably work a little bit better if you start with some ground rules. All right, let's take a look at the code. I hope, yes. So the code links are definitely in the resources page. I'm going to go to let's see. I don't think I had that window open, so I'm going to go ahead and open it now. This is the Jupyter Hub, same one that we've been using, same one that Vass was using earlier. I haven't signed in yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, but it probably remembers who I am from a previous session. and it's going to start a server for me. There we go. And I'm going to go into Jupyter Notebooks. And for this one, we're using the metadata search and discovery notebook. All right. So this basically walks us through all the steps of getting something new into the Petrel Data Globus tutorial index. So I'll actually go back as we go through this notebook and show you how things get added. The first thing we need to do is basically those key ingredients that I talked about. What is the endpoint that we're using to host data on? What is the group that can view data sets? All that. And so I'm just going to go ahead and set all those things up. As Vas mentioned earlier, because I logged in to Jupyter Hub using Globus, Jupyter Hub already has all the tokens that it needs for me to use the transfer service to move my data, the search service for me to add new entries to the index, and the minid service so that I can, that's the Fair Research Identifier service, so that I can mint myself an identifier for my new data set. So basically what I'm going to be doing in this notebook is I'm going to publish a new data set in Petrel. And so this is all the code that a gateway would have to do that for me. So let's see. Right. So because I already have the tokens, all I have to do is pull them out of the Jupyter Hub's session cache, and that should be set. Let me just go ahead and run the code to make sure that works. So here's my transfer token, my search token, and my minid token. So I'm going to use 3 different APIs for this demonstration, all of them with tokens that are generated by Globus. Okay, the first thing that I need to do is assemble my new data set. So I've already transferred the data to Petrel. There is a data set sitting on the Petrel endpoint. I use Globus to do that. In any of the session or any of the previous sections of this tutorial, you saw how a gateway can help a user move their data into a shared place. I'm not going to do that part. What I am going to do, though, is I have generated, as part of that upload, I generated a kind of master file or an index file. It's a JSON file that has the list of all the files in my data sets so that it's all there in one place. And now I need to get that onto Petrel, and I need to know where it is. So just to back up a second, if I were writing a gateway, I would probably give my users a tool that they could use, either in the gateway web app or a command line tool that they could download, that they would run over a directory on their local system that would do the transfer into Petrel, okay? And the reason for that is just so that they would make sure that all the things that have to do with large file data transfers. You want to make sure every single file gets there, even if there's 100,000 of them. You want to make sure they're all checksum to make sure that no bits got flipped along the way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm assuming that all that's been done. And in the process of doing that, I generated this thing we call a manifest, which is basically just one file that has the list of everything in it, where it got transferred to. And let's see. Before I do that, I'm going to create a directory. This is very similar to what Vas did in the previous session. I'm going to create a directory. In this case, I'm just going to generate a random UUID. I'm not even going to base it off of my UUID. I'm just going to create a brand new one that's never been used before, in all likelihood. There it is. There's a new path on the endpoint. This, by the way, is a link to that new path in Globus. So if I open up this window, I'm going to open up the Globus web app and go directly to that particular file. Yep. So there's the path right there. There's nothing in it right now. Okay. That's all I wanted to show you, is that it's brand new directory, fresh, scratch, never been used before. Here is the tutorial endpoint and share. Let me make sure that I'm not getting ahead of myself here. Because I want to make sure I get my file. Right. Right, so this is where I want to, I knew I was going to do this. My notes file where I have everything I need to copy and paste is over here. I'm going to change, basically what I'm doing is I'm going to change what's in the notebook so that instead of getting what the notebook normally does, I get my file. Okay, here is my endpoint. Normally your gateway would let people browse to specify where their manifest file was. Or maybe it would know where the manifest file is because it generated already itself. But this is basically my endpoint and my manifest file. And now I'm happy. I think that was all I needed to change there. Okay. And I have submitted a transfer task. Doesn't output anything at all. And so we provided this little section here to let us see what's been transferred. It basically waits on the, so here's the transfer submit task, get the task description, and we're doing a task wait on that. We're waiting for the transfer to finish. If I go, oops, no, I didn't. I did execute that, didn't I? Let's just see. If I go into Globus, oh, there's a task active. It knows about the file, but it hasn't finished copying it. I wonder why it's taking so long. That's really weird. Well, the good news is that at least it created the file. So it hasn't finished yet, huh? I'm going to be nervous Nelly and check on it again. Huh. Normally I wouldn't care about this, but since I'm doing a demo, I would kind of like it to finish. It's not a very big file at all. What's it doing? Scanned a file. Huh. Oh. Well, like I said, the good thing is that it actually created the file, which was really all I needed at this point. The fact that it hasn't finished transferring the data into the file doesn't matter because all I need is a path, and I've got that. Let's see. So down here in the next section, oh, it says transfer still running. Ah, okay, so it has finished. I know that because it displayed the file name here. That basically means that file has finished being transferred, so we're ready to go on. So either way, the next step is to set an access rule. So I'm going to, the rule data is to give a group. It's going to be the tutorial users group. Read access to that particular directory. So let's just go ahead and do that. I want to make sure that my partners, my research partners, have access to the data. So I just did that. And if I were now to, I'm just going to be a little bit detail oriented here and go back and show you. Here's the directory that it's in. If I click on permissions, tutorial users, oh, this is the slash directory. What I really want is, oh, man. What I really want is this directory, 7E28, okay. I don't know where that's going to be on this list. We've done so many different tutorials. Anyway, you can see that people are giving directories or
Can you
giving
search?
permissions to tutorial users. Sorry?
You can search, right? Can you search for that string? 7E, whatever.
Yeah, I could, but you're just going to have to take my word for it that we've given permission to the tutorial users group to that particular directory, and all is well. Let's see. So that's where we did that. That's where we did that. Access rule created successfully. We're good. All right. So my manifest file is basically there on the endpoint now. The next step is to create some metadata that describes it. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to change the default metadata. And the reason I'm going to do that is so that it stands out in our index. Okay. So here's what I'm ingesting. I'm ingesting a Moose data set. This is all Moose data. And it's for Gateways 2020. And we've got these contributors. It's for today's date. The keywords are, this is a validated data set. Woohoo. It's about Moose. It was done for Gateways 2020, and it's a manifest file. So those are just some keywords we're going to use to make it easier to find this file. And this is where we needed that that file to be there. We basically need to include its URL in the metadata record so that it's linked to the file itself. So let's go ahead and create that. And now we need to associate an identifier with that. This is where we use the up here we imported the MINID package. That's the Fair Research Identifiers service. Historically, it's called MINID. No real reason anybody needs to know that anymore. But basically, we're going to, let's see, the location is going to be, right. So here is the metadata that we created. Metadata contributor, the contributors are the contributors, the metadata date, the date is the date, title is the title. Why are we messing with that? Oh, we checksummed. Okay, we're checksumming it, and we're going to register it. Let's go ahead and do it. Okay, we have created an identifier using the MINID API. This is the identifier, it's a handle. This is the location of the actual file. And you can see this is a Globus HTTPS link. And then here's the metadata that was associated with it, the contributors, the date, the title. I don't think the tags were included. Oh, keywords. Yeah, okay. No, I don't see the keywords there. Oh, well, whatever. But the nice thing is that now if you look at this, this is the handle right here. Notice that it's got these numbers. They're right here. If I were to go to the nt2.net resolver, it now knows about my identifier. So I registered it with the Fair Research Identifier Service, but I can now look at it in identifiersfairresearch.org, same thing, or the names to things resolver. I can look it up in a lot of different places and use any of these identifiers in papers or whatever I want to use. I can also use it in my search index, and that's where it's really going to be important, is because in our search index, this is the search index that we're using. It's called Globus World 2018 Tutorial. It's got a description, and here is how we use, way up here, we imported, where's the beginning? We imported Globus SDK, and that has the search API in it. So down here, okay, we're going to index. So I just printed out the information about the index that we're using. Now I'm going to set up an ingest of my particular, I'm basically creating an entry in that index that has the metadata that we created, including the identifier. So there's the identifier down here. Here's everything else here is the metadata. So all this stuff is what gets indexed, and this down, no, actually all of this gets indexed. Yeah, all of this gets indexed, including the identifier. The subject is what is referred to by that entry. So that's basically how we know where the actual data is. And now if I were to go back, where did I put petrol? There it is. If I were to go back to petrol, where are you, petrol data, .net? Here. Before we looked at the materials data facility, I'm going to look at the Globus tutorial project. That's where all this stuff is going. You'll see there are a small number of records here, but one of them is from October 15th, 2020. And it should be my Moose data set. There it is. So it's been populated into the index and it already shows up. It added this particular date to the facets. It added Moose as a keyword. It added Gateways 2020 as a keyword. I can now filter results based on any of those things. Moose. There might be two mooses because I did one earlier too. So I did one on Monday as well. That was the dry run data set. This is the Moose data set. So basically, this is just showing you that even though we were doing all that in the Jupyter notebook, it actually does show up on Petrol as a new data set that's now available. Now that I have this data set here, I should be able to, what happens when I hit this? I don't remember. We might not have these links working. Yeah, I don't think we have the automatic links to the service working, but if I copy and paste this URL, I'm already logged into Globus, so I don't think I'm going to have to do very much authentication. Nope, there's the data set. So this is actually the contents of that Moose. If you, let's see, let's break it down a little bit farther. Yeah, here are all the individual records. Each of these is a file in my data set. Remember, I told you that this was a JSON file, and what it's got in it is the references to each of the individual files in my Moose data set. And you'll notice also that each one of these is also a Petrol Globus link. And so any of these things can be accessed via Petrol. If I were to give that link to somebody else, let's open up a different web browser that I haven't logged in with. Enter it in, you'll see that they have to log in. So I gave it to somebody at a different university. It's actually my alter ego at the University of Michigan where I went to school. This is not the person who just ran the Jupyter notebook, it's somebody else. I will go through, give it permission to access things on Petrol for me. And there's the data. Chrome displays things a little bit differently than Firefox does, but same thing, same data. So basically that shows you that the data is now on Petrol. It's in the index, it's searchable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is how you use the identifier service to mint IDs, and that is how you use Globus Search to add your metadata to an index and make it searchable. The rest of the notebook, which I don't really have a lot of time to go through, the rest of the notebook shows you how to use the search API to actually get search results back. So here, if I do a text query for Lee Liming, you'll get back the two entries that I put in. They're both Moose data sets. One of them's the preliminary one. Where's the title? Yeah, Gateways 2020 Moose data set and pre-tutorial dry run data set. That's what the search results look like in the Python side of things. Or if you want to see what the faceted results look like, Where does that show up? Not there. Complex queries. Ah. I forget where it is, where it shows the search facets. Any help there, Vass?
Yeah, that last one showed them. It just doesn't print it out nicely. I mean, there's your keywords, right? Validated, moose, gateways, manifest file. Right, those were the
Right.
4 keywords that show
Yeah,
up. In,
usually it gives me JSON where it shows for each tag how many hits there are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah,
That's not one of
these
these
sample
things.
queries have changed over time. So there's that. I was just replying earlier to a question from Mona. The query API is very, very flexible and powerful, and there's like a million things you can do with it. So we just show a couple of basics here, but you can, yeah, it's a pretty much a full-fledged SQL query type interface.
Right. Mona, I see you also asked a question. Is it possible to share an endpoint with anyone, not specific users or groups? Do you mean you want it to be public?
Yes.
You can share it with anybody who's logged in.
Yeah.
Without caring about who they are, but you can't make it anonymous.
Well, yeah, and I put a reply in there, Lee, and you can do it anonymously using HTTPS in a sense, but it's not quite fully anonymous because you can share a link that's open. But yeah.
Sorry, I didn't see your answer.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Are there any other questions that have been asked along the way that haven't been answered yet?
I don't know. I tried to cover them, but those that ask questions, please just feel free to speak up.
Yeah, we've reached the end of the tutorial, so it's just questions, answers, and goodbyes, I guess. Oh, I need to stop sharing.
So this recording will be available from the gateway site?
Presumably, I didn't.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know what the arrangements are. I think I do see it. It's being recorded, so I will. Mike from tech support, if he's tuned into us, may know where and how that will be available. I see he's the one that's recording it. So yeah.
Yeah, I just started recording it, just more of as a test. Like I know these tutorials aren't necessarily hosted anywhere or recorded by default.
Okay.
I can send you guys. I can put in a Dropbox folder and send you guys a link.
Yeah, that'd be useful. We can try and edit some of that. But yeah, certainly, these slides will be available. Again, I don't know what the plan is through the conference organizers, but I'm assuming we will be able to post slide decks for everyone.
So I've already put my slide decks in the resources file, and Bass, if you will send me your PDFs, I'll add them, or you can add them yourself. It's up to you.
Okay.
And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, the plan is that these Google Docs will assume will be available indefinitely. These are Google Docs that we're hosting, like Globus. And so,
I mean, we also, we post our slide decks on SlideShare, so you'll be able to get them directly from there, from our events website. That'll also be the canonical resource if you forget where all this conference stuff lives.
Okay, so that means I assume that I have to give you mine. Is that right, Beth?
Yeah, I mean, you have email waiting for you with that request.
All right. I will do that. Any other questions before we all go? I want to thank everybody for taking the time with us. It's been a long chunk of time in your day, I know. I hope this was useful.
Echo that, and offer folks to reach out directly and ask us questions. And again, we had some other side conversations. Be happy to continue them whenever you guys like.
And I would strongly encourage you to follow the links to the code, because it really is, the code and documentation that is there is meant to be studied and reused in your applications. They're really, there isn't a lot of code that's necessary to do these things because of the APIs that have been provided. We really tried to make it as easy as possible for developers to incorporate this stuff into their apps. So it's not a whole lot of stuff, but every line counts.
Thanks, guys.
Yep,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.